Hello, and welcome to tonight's episode, 12 Unseen True Crime Cases from America. I'm so happy you're here. Maybe your day was long, or maybe you just like drifting off with quiet stories. However you've come, this is your time for rest. Before we begin, please subscribe to Sleepy True Crime Stories. This way, you'll always have a calm place you can return with new stories waiting whenever you need them. So now, settle in, get comfortable, take a deep, slow breath, and let the stories begin. In the summer of 1993, the city of Minneapolis was alive with the sounds of warm evenings. Cars hummed steadily on the nearby streets, voices drifted through open windows, and the gentle breeze carried the scent of cut grass and summer rain. Among the many people moving quietly through the rhythm of that season was a woman named Jeanie Childs. Jeanie was 35 years old. Those who knew her described her as a woman with a warm heart and a calm presence. She wasn't the kind of person who sought attention. Instead, she lived in quieter ways, through kindness, through small gestures, through the simple routines that shaped her days. Her apartment near downtown was modest, but it was hers, a place where she could close the door to the busy city and feel the comfort of her own space. Her home reflected who she was. There were small, familiar touches that softened the edges of the room, a folded blanket on the couch, pictures tucked neatly in frames, and little details that carried memories of people she cared about. To Jeanie, these things weren't just decorations. They were reminders of belonging, of connection, of a life tied to family and friends. Jeanie's family remembered her most for her gentle nature. She was approachable, someone who listened carefully, someone who made others feel at ease in her company. Friends said she had a smile that seemed to quiet a room, not because it was loud or commanding, but because it was soft and genuine. In many ways, Jeanie's life was ordinary, a blend of daily routines and familiar struggles. Yet to the people who loved her, she was anything but ordinary. She was deeply valued, deeply loved. The city around her was not without its challenges. Minneapolis in the early 1990s was a place of contrasts, moments of beauty, moments of hardship. Jeanie, like many, faced those contrasts with quiet resilience. She carried forward day by day with the same gentleness that defined her character. As she moved through the summer of 1993, there was no way for her to know that her story would one day be remembered far beyond her circle of family and friends. At that time, she was simply living her life, going about her days in her own rhythm, marking time in her own way. And that is where her story begins, not with the tragedy that followed, but with the life she lived and the love she carried with her. The summer of 1993 drifted forward gently, carrying with it the ordinary rhythm of city life in Minneapolis. The days were long and warm, and evenings stretched into soft twilights where the air lingered with the sound of laughter, passing cars, and the hum of life moving quietly. For Jeanie, life unfolded in simple ways within the walls of her modest apartment near downtown. It was not a grand life, but it was hers, and she held to it with quiet steadiness. Her days often began without hurry. She moved through her routines calmly, small tasks, conversations with people she trusted, and errands that tied her to her neighborhood. Those who knew her described her as polite, soft-spoken, and kind. She was not someone who raised her voice or drew unnecessary attention. Instead, she was steady, someone who seemed to exist in gentle balance with the world around her. Still, beneath this sense of normalcy, there were challenges. The area she lived in carried its own risks, as many neighborhoods in a busy city do. Some nights the hallways were filled with unfamiliar footsteps, or the distant sound of raised voices echoed outside. Neighbors went about their lives, each aware of the tension that sometimes drifted into the air. It was not unusual in that place and time for people to lock their doors a little earlier, or to glance twice down a hallway before stepping out. Jeanie, living alone, was mindful of these things. Her apartment was her haven, a space she tried to keep safe and comfortable. She decorated with small touches that gave her a sense of peace, the kind of details that make a home feel personal and warm, even when the world outside feels uncertain. And so her summer carried on. Ordinary days, quiet nights, familiar patterns. There was no signal of what was coming, no clear warning that her story was about to take a tragic turn. To those around her, she was set implied Jeanie, living her life as best she could day by day. Yet in the background, unseen and unnoticed, the threads of fate were beginning to shift. What seemed like just another summer in Minneapolis would soon become the beginning of a mystery that would take nearly 3 decades to resolve. The evening that would change Jeanie's story began much like any other. Outside, the city of Minneapolis carried on in its familiar rhythm. The sun had dipped low, leaving behind a sky of fading gold and soft blue. Streetlights blinked on, one by one, casting quiet circles of light across sidewalks. From the nearby streets came the low hum of passing cars, and from open windows the faint murmur of televisions and radios filled the warm night air. Inside her small apartment, Jeanie was at home. For her, it was a space of comfort, a place where she could close out the world and find a measure of peace. The familiar objects around her reflected her life, small belongings, a few personal keepsakes, and the gentle signs of a woman who, like so many, lived simply. But sometime that night, her peace was broken. Behind her closed door, something irreversible happened. No neighbors saw it unfold. No one outside the apartment knew in that moment that a life was ending. It was quiet and final. When the night gave way to morning, the building stirred with its usual movement. Neighbors stepped out for work. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallways. Doors opened and closed. Yet something about Jeanie's apartment was different. There was a stillness there, a silence that seemed heavier than before. It wasn't long before that silence drew concern. Friends and neighbors began to realize they had not seen Jeanie, and worry grew. When police were called to check on her, they entered a scene that carried with it more questions than answers. Jeanie's life had been taken, she was gone, and in her place remained only mystery. There were no obvious signs of who had been there, no clear trail pointing to the person responsible. The apartment that had once been her safe place was now something else entirely. A place that held loss and silence, and the beginning of a long search for truth. For those who loved her, the news was devastating. Their Jeanie, with her quiet smile and gentle heart, was gone. The grief was sharp, but so too was the confusion. How could this have happened, and why? In the quiet days that followed, the absence of Jeanie's presence was felt most strongly by those around her. Neighbors who were used to seeing her coming and going began to notice the silence. Her door, once opened regularly, stayed closed. There was no sound of movement inside, no trace of her gentle routines. When concern grew, friends and police stepped in. What they found inside her apartment was not the calm refuge Jeanie had created, but a scene of unanswered questions. Her life had been taken, and the quiet walls of her home now carried a different weight. Investigators could tell that someone had been there, yet the person had left behind little to guide them. There were no obvious signs of forced entry, no clear witness who could explain what had happened in those final hours. In the early days, officers spoke to those who lived nearby. Some thought they remembered faint noises late at night, a sound of footsteps in the hallway, or a door that closed softly when it should not have. Others admitted they had heard nothing at all. The details were vague, fragile fragments of memory that provided no certain direction. For Jeanie's family, the news was unbearable. Grief settled in quickly, heavy with the knowledge that her life had ended in violence. Alongside the pain was the haunting question of who could have done such a thing and why. It was the kind of question that lingers in the air, unanswered and unsettling. For investigators, the mystery deepened by the day. The few clues they had did not form a clear picture. Though they collected what evidence they could, the truth seemed to slip away, hidden in the silence of the apartment. What began as an urgent search for answers gradually slowed. Each lead seemed to fade, each interview left more questions than conclusions, and as days stretched into weeks, the case that began with such shock and sorrow slowly shifted toward uncertainty. Still, the memory of Jeanie remained with those who loved her. They spoke her name, they remembered her smile, and they held on to the hope that one day the silence would be broken and the truth would be known. When detectives first stepped into Jeanie's apartment in 1993, they carried with them the urgency that comes in the earliest hours of any investigation. They photographed the scene carefully, collected items that might prove important, and took statements from those who lived nearby. In those first days, there was still hope that answers would come quickly. But as the days stretched forward, the work grew more complicated. In the early 1990s, forensic science was not what it is today. DNA testing existed, but it was still limited, often requiring larger samples and producing results that were far less precise. The evidence gathered in Jeanie's home did not immediately point to a suspect. Without a witness, without a confession, and without technology to bridge the gaps, investigators found themselves with a case that was already beginning to grow cold. Still, they did not let go. Over the years, detectives reopened her file, each one reading through the reports, hoping to see something the last person had missed. They reviewed notes, re-examined photographs, and followed up on the few leads that trickled in. Tips came occasionally, sometimes from people who thought they remembered something, sometimes from those who simply hoped to help, but none of those paths led to certainty. The case became one of many unsolved tragedies in the city. Jeanie's name sat among others in folders stacked on shelves, waiting, yet her story was not forgotten by the people who carried her file. For some detectives, it became a reminder of the work they carried with them every day, that justice does not always come quickly, and that sometimes the only thing to do is to keep waiting for science or time to provide what people alone cannot. As the years passed, science slowly began to change. DNA testing improved, becoming more sensitive, more exact. By the 2000s and 2010s, cases once thought impossible to solve were being revisited. For Jeanie's family, this meant a new kind of hope. The belief that perhaps one day the quiet evidence collected in 1993 might finally have its voice. For now, though, her story remained in silence. Investigators held on, patient and persistent, knowing that the truth often waits longer than anyone expects. The answers in Jeanie's case did not come from a sudden confession or a witness who finally spoke out. Instead, they came slowly, through the quiet progress of science. Nearly 3 decades after her life was taken, investigators returned to the evidence that had been carefully preserved in 1993. By then, DNA testing had transformed, and a new method, genetic genealogy, was beginning to reshape the world of unsolved cases. This method worked differently than the older forms of testing. Instead of comparing DNA to a single suspect, investigators could now search public family tree databases, looking for partial matches to distant relatives. From there, they could build out family lines and narrow in on a possible suspect. It was careful, patient work. But in cases that had gone cold, it was often the first new spark in years. When Jeanie's case was tested, that spark appeared. The genetic trail pointed toward a man named Jerry Westrom. On the surface, he was not someone who stood out in connection to Jeanie's life. He had gone on to live quietly, raising a family, working and moving through the years without drawing suspicion. But the DNA told a different story. Investigators began to watch him carefully. They waited for a moment when they could collect his DNA without his knowledge. That moment came at a hockey game, when Westrom discarded a napkin after eating. Detectives retrieved it, and the results were undeniable. The DNA from the crime scene matched. When confronted, Westrom denied involvement, but the science was steady, the evidence clear. After years of silence, Jeanie's case was now moving forward again, this time toward a courtroom. In 2022, nearly 30 years after her death, Westrom stood trial. The jury heard about the years of investigation, the careful work of scientists, and the persistence of detectives who had never given up. The courtroom car. With the weight of decades, as if every unanswered question was finally being spoken aloud. And when the verdict was delivered, guilty, it marked the end of a chapter that had been open for far too long. It was not confession that brought justice, but the steady voice of science and the patience of time. When the verdict was finally read in 2022, the moment carried with it a deep mixture of emotions. For Jeanie's family, there was relief in knowing that the truth had been revealed after so many years. The silence that had hung over her story for nearly 3 decades was finally broken. But along with that relief came sorrow. Nothing could bring Jeanie back. The years they had lost with her could not be returned, and the pain of her absence was still present, softened perhaps by time, but never erased. Some of Jeanie's family members spoke quietly about what it meant to see justice done. They had lived through long stretches of waiting, through updates that led nowhere, through hope that often felt fragile. To finally hear that the person responsible had been named and convicted gave them a measure of peace. It did not heal everything, but it allowed them to close their eyes at night with fewer questions. For the investigators who had carried her case, the moment was also powerful. Some had worked the file in the early years, while others inherited it later, each adding their own notes, their own efforts, always hoping to be the one to see it through. To watch the case reach a conclusion after so much time reminded them of why persistence matters in their work. Justice may not always come quickly, but when it does, it is worth the wait. In the wider community, Jeannie's name was spoken again. Many had not heard of her story before, or had forgotten it with the passing years. But the news of the verdict brought her memory back into the public eye. She was no longer just a name on a cold case list. She was remembered as a woman who had lived, who had mattered, and whose story had finally been honoured. The emotional aftermath was not about celebration, but about quiet recognition. Justice had been slow, but it had come, and with it, Jeannie's family could hold on to the knowledge that she had not been forgotten, and that the truth had at last been found. The story of Jeanie Childs reminds us that time does not always erase truth. For nearly 3 decades, her case seemed like it might remain forever unanswered, resting quietly in the shadows of the past. Yet through patience, persistence, and the quiet progress of science, the silence eventually gave way to clarity. Her life, though ended too soon, was not forgotten. She was more than the way her story concluded. She was a daughter, a friend, and a woman remembered for her gentle spirit. To those who knew her, she was someone whose presence mattered, someone who brought kindness into the lives she touched. In telling her story, it is important to remember her not only for the tragedy, but also for the life she lived, a life filled with small, ordinary moments that carried deep meaning for those who loved her. There is a lesson here, tucked quietly within her case. It is that perseverance matters. Even when years pass, even when answers seem unreachable, there is value in holding on to hope. Sometimes justice takes time, longer than anyone wishes, but that does not mean it will never arrive. For Jeanie, the truth waited patiently, carried forward by the determination of investigators and the devotion of her family. Her case also shows us how far we have come. The tools that revealed her truth did not exist in 1993. They were born of years of scientific progress, advances that gave voice to evidence that had once been silent. It is a reminder that each step forward in understanding can bring peace to families still waiting, still hoping. And so, as we close Jeanie's story, we do so gently, with respect. She is remembered not only for the mystery that surrounded her, but for the kindness that defined her. Her case, once cold, now rests quietly with resolution. As the city of Minneapolis continued on, life moved forward, as it always does. But her memory endures, a quote does. A reminder that truth, no matter how long delayed, has the power to come home. Now, let us softly turn the page and begin our next story. In the winter of 1957, Philadelphia was a city carrying the quiet weight of cold days and long nights. The season brought bare trees and frosted windows, and in many homes, families gathered close for warmth. It was a time of post-war America when communities felt both proud of their growth and quietly watchful of the changes that seemed to be unfolding across the country. In the midst of this backdrop, a story emerged that would linger for decades, the story of a young boy who became known only as America's unknown child. His true name, his family, his history, all of it was lost to time, leaving behind only questions. Yet what remained was the simple truth that he had lived. He had laughed once, cried once, and belonged, even if only for a short while, to someone's world. Those who would later investigate his case often spoke of how much sadness was contained in his story. A child, so young, discovered in circumstances that were mysterious and tragic. He was thought to be about 4 to 6 years old, a boy with bright eyes that no one would ever again see open. No school records were linked to him, no missing child reports matched his description. He stood apart, a life unclaimed, a story untold. The newspapers would later call him the boy in the box, after the simple container in which he was found. But to many who worked on his case, he was more than that. He was not just evidence, not just another mystery. He was a child who had lived and who deserved to be remembered with dignity. His story begins not with what happened to him, but with the recognition that he was once here, walking, speaking, laughing perhaps, in the way children do. Though the world may not have known him by name, his life still mattered. His memory still carries meaning, and so, as we step gently into his story, we do so with care, for while we may never know all of the details of his short life, we can honor the truth that he was here and that his story deserves to be told with softness and respect. The 1950s were often remembered as a time of order and tradition in America. In cities like Philadelphia, families gathered around their kitchen tables, neighbors exchanged greetings across fences, and children played in the streets until the evening lights flickered on. There was a sense, at least on the surface, that life was steady, predictable, and safe, but underneath that image of stability were stories that did not always fit. Not every child grew up in a home filled with warmth. Some lived in quiet hardship, their struggles hidden behind closed doors. It is within this space, between the appearance of safety and the reality of difficulty, that the mystery of the boy in the box seems to rest. Little is known of the days that led to his final hours. No missing persons report was filed that matched his description. No school teacher came forward to say he had been absent from class. No neighbor recalled seeing him vanish from a familiar yard. His life, before his discovery, was invisible to the public record, and yet it was real. He walked somewhere, he played somewhere, and he belonged somewhere, even if those details remain hidden. For investigators, this absence was perhaps the most haunting part of the story. It was not only the loss of a child's life, but the loss of his identity. Without a name, even grief felt incomplete. He could not be placed within a family tree, could not be tied to a specific home, could not be connected to the kind of background that helps people understand who someone was. As the city continued with its routines in early 1957, no one knew that a tragedy was quietly waiting to be uncovered in a small, forgotten place. Life carried on. Children bundled up against the cold, families prepared warm meals in their kitchens, workers came and went from their jobs. All while, just beyond sight, the story of a young boy remained untold. The build-up to his discovery was not marked by drama or obvious warning signs. Instead, it was shaped by silence. And in that silence, a child's life slipped quietly away, leaving the world unaware until a chance encounter would bring his story to light. It was a cold February day in 1957 when the quiet stillness of a wooded area just outside Philadelphia was interrupted. Along a roadside in Fox Chase, a place where the trees stood bare and the ground was hard with winter frost, a small box lay discarded. It was the kind of box people used for household goods, plain and unremarkable at first glance. For a time it sat unnoticed, just another object left behind in the quiet sprawl of the woods. But eventually, curiosity drew someone closer. Inside the box was something no one expected to see. Wrapped in a blanket lay the body of a young boy, no older than 6. He was small, fragile, and alone. There was no note to explain who he was, no belongings to connect him to a home or family. Only the blanket and the cardboard that surrounded him remained. The discovery spread slowly at first. A hunter came across the box, then hesitated, unsure of what he had found. Later, when police were called, the truth settled in with quiet heaviness. This was not just an abandoned object, it was a child, and with that realization came questions that would ripple through the city for years to come. Investigators noted that his hair had been recently cut, unevenly, as though done in haste. His body showed signs that his life had ended violently, though the exact details were difficult to determine. What struck many, however, was how alone he seemed. No one came forward to claim him. No one reported him missing. For the people who first encountered him, the moment left a lasting mark. It was not only the sadness of finding a young boy's life cut short, but the strangeness of the silence that followed. He seemed to have come from nowhere, as though he had slipped out of the folds of the city without leaving a trace behind. The box, so ordinary in itself, became a symbol of mystery. From that day forward, the boy inside it would be remembered. Not by his name, but by that image. The child in the cardboard box, waiting for someone to remember him. When the boy was first discovered, investigators hoped that identifying him would be the simplest part of the case. Surely someone, somewhere, would notice his absence. A family would step forward or a missing child report would match his description. But as the days passed, silence answered their search. No family came, no name was offered. The little boy remained unknown. This absence was deeply unsettling. Police canvassed neighborhoods across Philadelphia, knocking on doors, asking questions, showing sketches that tried to capture the boy's likeness. They searched through school records and hospital files, hoping that somewhere a clue would emerge. yet nothing connected. It was as though he had never been a part of the city at all. Some investigators began to wonder if his disappearance had been deliberately hidden. Perhaps someone close to him had worked carefully to ensure that no one could connect his life to his final resting place. The freshly cut hair, the lack of clothing or belongings, even the choice of a simple cardboard box, all seemed to suggest an attempt to erase him, to make him anonymous. But the human heart resists anonymity. Those who worked the case could not forget his face. They carried his photograph. They studied the shape of his eyes, the lines of his features, imagining what his life might have been. To them, he was not just an unknown child. He was a boy who deserved to be seen, even if no one claimed him. The public, too, became drawn into the mystery. Newspapers carried the story, and the boy's image was shared widely. Readers wrote letters, speculating about where he might have come from or who might be missing him. Tips flowed in from across the city and beyond. But for every possible lead, investigators found themselves facing another dead end. The sense of cover-up grew stronger. Someone, it seemed, had taken care to ensure that this child's name would remain hidden. Yet despite the mystery, his story could not be erased. Even without a name, his discovery had left a mark on the community, and his memory had already begun to take root in the hearts of strangers who felt connected to him. The boy remained silent, but the search for him, for his identity, his truth, was only just beginning. From the very beginning, investigators dedicated themselves to uncovering the truth about the boy. Detectives pored over the smallest of details, studying the box itself, the blanket in which he was wrapped, and the traces left at the scene. They examined the boy's features carefully, hoping that someone, somewhere, would recognize him. Yet, with each effort, the silence deepened. The investigation quickly grew larger than anyone expected. Hundreds of leads were pursued, hospitals were contacted, schools were checked, and orphanages were visited. Every child who might match his description was accounted for, and still none of them were him. Detectives considered the possibility that he had come from outside the city, perhaps even from far away, making the task of finding his origins even more difficult. Over the years, many theories emerged. Some believed he might have been a child from a foster home or a boy who had lived in secrecy, hidden away from the world. Others thought he might have been abandoned by parents who feared being discovered. None of these theories could ever be proven, and each one faded into uncertainty. The case grew heavy on the hearts of those who carried it. Detectives spoke of how they would take the boy's image home with them, unable to set the mystery aside. They referred to him with compassion, not just as evidence, but as someone who mattered. To them, he was never a stranger. He was a child who deserved justice, no matter how much time passed. As years turned to decades, the investigation changed hands many times. New detectives stepped in, each reviewing the file, adding their own notes, hoping to be the one to solve it. In the 1990s and 2000s, new technology brought fresh attempts, with DNA testing offering possibilities that had once been unthinkable. Yet, even then, his identity remained out of reach. The boy in the box became one of Philadelphia's most enduring mysteries, carried like a quiet burden by the police force and the community alike. His case file grew thicker, his image more familiar, yet the answer to the simplest question, who was he, remained just beyond reach. And so the investigation continued year after year. Each attempt, each revisit was an act of persistence. For though his story was incomplete, those who worked on it refused to let it be forgotten. In the years after the boy's discovery, the case never left the public's memory. Newspapers revisited the story from time to time, reminding readers of the small child whose identity was still unknown. And with that attention came a pattern that investigators would come to know well. Confessions, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, from people who claimed to know the truth. Some came forward with stories that seemed convincing at first. They described details that on the surface aligned with what investigators already knew. Others claimed to have been witnesses or even participants. For detectives, each confession was carefully studied, compared against the evidence, and weighed with patience. But one by one, these statements began to crumble. Facts didn't line up, timelines didn't match, stories contradicted themselves. The truth, it seemed, slipped away every time someone reached for it. There were moments when investigators felt close to a breakthrough. A tip would surface that seemed promising, leading them to believe the case might finally move forward. But just as quickly the trail would fade, leaving behind only disappointment. False hope became a familiar companion. Over time, these confessions revealed something about human nature. Some people wanted attention. Others perhaps felt guilt for things unrelated and sought to unburden themselves. A few might even have convinced themselves they were tied to the mystery when they were not, but none of them brought the clarity the boy deserved. And so, unlike many cases where justice comes in the form of a trial and a verdict, the boy in the box remained different. There was no courtroom testimony that solved his story, no single moment where truth was laid bare. Instead, there was only the passing of time and the persistence of questions. For investigators, this was one of the hardest truths to accept. They were trained to believe that every case could find resolution, that evidence would eventually lead to justice. But in this story, the confessions only deepened the mystery. Each false ending left the boy unnamed, his life still wrapped in silence. Even so, they carried on. The absence of answers did not erase their responsibility. The boy remained theirs to protect, even without justice, even without recognition. And in that commitment, his story endured. As the years passed, the little boy without a name became more than just a mystery. He became a symbol, a reminder of unanswered questions, of the fragility of life, and of the quiet determination of those who refused to forget him. The people of Philadelphia came to know him as the boy in the box, but also as America's unknown child. Both names reflected the sadness of his story, but also the way he had found a place in the hearts of strangers. Detectives who carried his file often spoke of how the case stayed with them long after their shifts ended. His image was etched into their memory, his small frame wrapped in a blanket, the innocence of a child whose story was incomplete. For many, solving his case became a personal mission, even as the years stretched into decades. They felt a responsibility not only to the law but to him, to make sure his story was not lost. The community too carried the weight of his absence. People who had no connection to him found themselves touched by his story. Some left flowers near the site where he had been discovered. Others wrote letters to newspapers, expressing sorrow that no family had stepped forward. For them, the boy had become a child shared by all, someone everyone wished they could comfort, someone everyone hoped would one day be given back his name. Even in death, he was cared for. When he was buried, those who arranged his funeral gave him dignity, with a small headstone to mark his place. Years later, when his grave was moved to a new resting spot, the community gathered again. The simple marker read, America's Unknown Child. It was a name born of sorrow, but also of belonging, an acknowledgement that he was not forgotten. The emotional aftermath stretched far beyond Philadelphia. His story reached readers and listeners across the country, each one reminded that behind every mystery is a real human life. Though decades had passed, his memory still stirred compassion. He had no family to speak for him publicly, but in a way, the entire community became his family, carrying his story forward. And so, even without answers, his life continued to touch others. The mystery endured, but so did the tenderness with which he was remembered. The story of the boy in the box is one of silence, mystery, and unanswered questions. For decades, he remained unnamed, his life a puzzle that investigators, journalists, and ordinary people alike tried to piece together. And while the case never found the resolution so many hoped for, his memory endured. There is a quiet lesson in his story. It reminds us that every life matters, even those that slip through the cracks of history. Though no family came forward to claim him, the community stepped in to hold his memory. Detectives carried his photograph in their files, residents left flowers at his grave, writers and readers kept his name alive in print. In this way, he was not forgotten. He became a child watched over by many, a symbol of compassion and persistence. For the people who worked his case, the lack of resolution was painful, but it also kept them searching. Each generation of investigators passed his file along with the unspoken promise that they would not let him fade, and in this persistence lies another quiet truth, that justice is not always swift, but the effort to seek it is a form of care in itself. The boy in the box may never be fully known. His name, his story, his beginnings, they may remain hidden. Yet what we do know is enough to remember him as more than just a mystery. He was a child, innocent and small, who deserved love and safety. And while those things may not have been present in his final days, they are present now in the way he is remembered, spoken of, and honored. When we reflect on his story, we are reminded of the importance of compassion for those who are unseen and unheard. Even when answers remain beyond reach, we can still hold space for dignity, for care, and for remembrance. As the decades moved on, Philadelphia grew and changed, but his memory remained, a quiet thread woven into the city's history. And so, as we close this chapter, we do so softly, carrying his story with us. Now we turn gently to the next case, another life, another memory, waiting to be told. In the early 1990s, Plano, Texas, was a growing community, filled with families who sought the comfort of quiet neighborhoods, good schools, and the sense of safety that comes with small-town living. Even as the area began to expand, it was a place where children rode their bikes along sidewalks, where families gathered at parks on weekends, and where the laughter of children often drifted through the air on warm afternoons. Among the many families who made Plano their home was the Estell family. At the heart of their world was a little girl named Ashley. She was just 7 years old in 1993, a bright and lively child who brought joy to everyone who knew her. Friends and family described her as cheerful, full of energy, and the kind of child who made others smile with her presence. Ashley had that unique spark that children often carry, a curiosity about the world, an eagerness to be part of every game, every story, every moment of life unfolding around her. She was deeply loved by her parents, her siblings, and extended family. To them, she was not just a child. She was the light in their home, the one whose laughter filled the rooms and whose small footsteps were a sound of comfort. Her days were filled with the ordinary joys of childhood, playing outside, spending time with friends, learning at school, and sharing moments of closeness with her family. Those who knew her often spoke about her innocence, her laughter, and her ability to bring warmth wherever she went. She was the kind of child whose presence was felt easily, a bright little star whose life touched everyone around her. In September of 1993, Ashley's world was much like any other child's. School was in session, the Texas summer was giving way to the cooler days of fall, and families were busy with their usual rhythms of work, sports, and weekend gatherings. No one could have imagined that this ordinary high season, filled with the routines of everyday life, would soon become a time remembered for tragedy. Ashley's story is remembered today not only because of the loss that followed, but because of the love she carried in her short years and the way her memory has continued to shape the community she left behind. Her life mattered, deeply, beautifully, and it is with that recognition that we begin her story. It was September of 1993, and the season in Plano, Texas was shifting gently toward fall. The air carried a softer breeze, and families looked forward to weekends spent outdoors, watching their children play soccer beneath the wide Texas sky. Soccer tournaments were a regular part of life in the community. Parents gathered along the sidelines, siblings ran and played nearby, and the fields were filled with the sound of whistles, cheers, and laughter. For the Estell family, that September weekend began like so many others. Ashley was with her parents at one of these tournaments, surrounded by the hum of people, the excitement of children competing, and the comfort of familiar routines. The environment seemed safe. There were crowds everywhere, with parents keeping watch and children running freely. It was the kind of setting where danger felt far away, where families relaxed in the presence of one another. Ashley, being 7 years old, was full of energy. She wandered about in the way children often do, curious, playful, eager to see more than just the game unfolding on the field. Her family and the community around her trusted that she was safe among so many watchful eyes. After all, this was not a secluded place. It was public, filled with the everyday security of neighbors, coaches, and friends. Yet within that ordinary gathering, something was quietly shifting. Unknown to those enjoying the tournament, the day was carrying with it the beginnings of a tragedy. For Ashley, what began as another playful weekend would soon become the last day of her young life. The crowd did not sense it. Parents were chatting, children were laughing, and games went on as planned. To most, it was simply another Saturday, a time of joy and togetherness. But woven into the background of this ordinary day was a moment that no one could anticipate, a moment that would change everything. Not only for Ashley's family, but for the entire community. It is often in the midst of the familiar that the most unexpected events occur. For Ashley, the safety of a public gathering did not protect her from the shadow that was moving quietly, unseen within the crowd. The soccer tournament in Plano carried on with its usual energy. Children ran across the fields, their laughter mixing with the sounds of whistles and cheers. Parents leaned against fences or sat on folding chairs, their eyes shifting between the games and their conversations. To those present, it was simply a Saturday filled with ordinary joys. But sometime during that day, Ashley slipped away from the crowd. No one realized it at first. In the swirl of activity, it was easy for a child to wander just a few steps too far. Her family believed she was nearby, safe among familiar faces. Yet the moments passed, and Ashley did not return. What happened in those minutes remains one of the most painful truths of her story. A man, a stranger to her family, approached Ashley. He lured her away quietly, unnoticed by those gathered at the tournament. In the midst of so many people, Ashley vanished. The realization came slowly, then all at once. Her family began to call her name. At first their voices were steady, expecting her to appear quickly as children often do. But when minutes turned into more, their voices grew urgent. Others joined in, looking, searching, scanning the fields and walkways. The tournament, once filled with cheerful noise, shifted to a quieter kind of tension as word spread that a little girl was missing. The search widened and police were called, yet despite the efforts of family, friends, officers and volunteers, Ashley did not come back. The day that had begun in laughter ended in silence. Later, her absence was explained by the discovery no one wished to face. Ashley's life had been taken. The details of how she died were held quietly by investigators and shared only in the most careful ways. What mattered most was not the manner of her loss, but the fact of it. A child who had brought joy to her family and community was gone. The tournament grew. Friends would never feel the same again. What had been a place of safety and play became a place marked by memory, the place where Ashley was last seen alive. When word spread that Ashley was missing, the soccer tournament shifted from a place of celebration to one of concern. Families who had come to watch their children play suddenly found themselves scanning the fields, the parking lots, and the spaces in between. Coaches paused games and parents began moving in small groups, calling Ashley's name into the air, hoping to hear her voice respond. At first, there was a fragile hope that she had simply wandered off, perhaps chasing after another child, or drawn by something that caught her curiosity. But as the search stretched on and no sign of her appeared, that hope grew thin. Police arrived, and with them came a deeper sense of worry. Officers walked the grounds carefully, asked questions, and organized volunteers into search teams. The community came together in those early hours. Strangers joined hands with Ashley's family, determined to bring her home. But despite the effort, the minutes became hours, and still she was not found. The daylight began to fade, and unease settled more heavily over the tournament grounds. Parents held their own children a little closer, sensing the sudden fragility of what had once felt so secure. The truth of Ashley's disappearance came in a way that was devastating. Not long after she vanished, her body was discovered away from the tournament. The silence of her absence now explained. The realization swept through Plano with a force that left the community shaken. This was not just the story of a child who had gone missing, it was the story of a life taken in a place where safety had seemed certain. The discovery left people struggling to understand. How could something so tragic have happened in broad daylight in a crowd filled with families, friends, and watchful eyes? It was a question that haunted her parents, her neighbors, and the investigators who would go on to pursue the TA with urgency. For Ashley's family, the moment was one of unbearable loss. The child who had filled their home with laughter was gone, and the search that began in hope had ended in heartbreak. Plano, too, carried the weight of that discovery. A community that had once felt protected by its closeness now faced the painful reality that tragedy could arrive quietly, even in the most familiar of places. When Ashley's loss became known, investigators moved quickly. A tragedy of this nature, happening so suddenly and in such a public place, demanded immediate attention. Police officers began retracing the steps of the day, speaking to those who had been at the tournament and asking if anyone had noticed something unusual. A stranger near the children, a car parked in the wrong place, or a moment that felt out of place. The search for answers spread beyond the soccer fields. Officers looked into nearby neighborhoods, highways, and businesses, hoping for any clue that might point to the person responsible. They worked with urgency, knowing that the community was shaken and the family was waiting for justice. It was not long before suspicion fell on a man named Michael Blair. He was already known to authorities and had a troubling history that drew their attention. Witnesses placed him near the tournament grounds, and physical evidence seemed to connect him to Ashley's case. The community, desperate for answers, held tightly to the hope that the investigators had found the person responsible. As the investigation deepened, police collected every piece of evidence they could. They interviewed Blair, compared his story with known facts, and presented their findings to prosecutors. For a time, it appeared that the case might move forward quickly, with Ashley's family finding some measure of justice in the midst of their grief. But behind the scenes, the work was complex. Gathering evidence strong enough to hold up in court was not simple. Forensics in the early 1990s were limited, and investigators had to rely heavily on circumstantial evidence, eyewitness testimony, and small fragments that did not always tell a complete story. Still, the weight of suspicion seemed to press toward Blair, and prosecutors believed they had enough to proceed. The investigation left the commune, nighty, holding its breath. Parents wondered how such a tragedy could happen in a crowded space, and many looked more closely at their own children, keeping them nearer than before. Plano was no longer the same quiet place it had been just days earlier. Fear had moved in, and with it came the deep desire for justice, for Ashley and for the safety of all children in the community. The case against Michael Blair moved into the courts with a sense of urgency. For Ashley's family and for the Plano community, there was hope that justice was close at hand. The tragedy of losing a child was unbearable, but the thought of accountability, of knowing that someone would answer for what had been done, gave many people strength to move forward. Blair, however, denied any involvement. He maintained his innocence, even as prosecutors presented the evidence they had gathered. In 1994, a jury heard the details of the case. They listened to witnesses who placed Blair near the tournament, and they reviewed the physical evidence that prosecutors believed tied him to Ashley's disappearance. After careful deliberation, the jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to death. For a time, it seemed the case was closed. The Estell family carried their grief with them, but they also carried the knowledge that someone had been held responsible. The community, too, found a measure of reassurance in the verdict, believing that the shadow over their city had been lifted. Yet the story did not end there. In the years that followed, advances in DNA testing reshaped how evidence could be understood. Old samples were re-examined, and new standards for accuracy were applied. When Blair's case was reviewed, the DNA evidence that once seemed compelling no longer supported the conviction. What followed was a long process of appeals, hearings, and reconsiderations. By 2008, after more than a decade on death row, Michael Blair's conviction was overturned. He was exonerated of Ashley's murder, though he remained incarcerated on other charges unrelated to her case. The courtroom that had once given a clear verdict now left behind uncertainty. For Ashley's family, the reversal was devastating. They had believed for years that justice had been served, only to learn that the case was ours. Hence again unresolved. The community too felt the weight of that uncertainty. Questions lingered, and the grief that had never truly faded was stirred again. The trial, once seen as the conclusion, had instead become another chapter of a story without a clear ending. For those who loved Ashley, the absence of justice was another loss layered upon the first. For Ashley's family, life was forever divided into the time before September 1993 and the time after. Their home, once filled with the sound of her laughter and the lightness of her presence, was now quiet in ways that could never be mended. The loss of a child is something no parent, no sibling, no grandparent can ever fully recover from. It lingers like a shadow that never fades, even as years pass. In the Plano community, the sorrow was deeply felt as well. Parents held their children closer, perhaps for longer than before, as they thought of Ashley and the fragility of safety. Schools, churches, and neighborhoods spoke quietly about her, not in sensational tones, but in hushed voices that reflected sorrow and caution. Her name became a reminder that even in a crowd, even in the midst of family and friends, tragedy can find its way. The trial and later exoneration of Michael Blair added another layer of grief for many. Families had believed that justice had been served, that the tragedy had found a resolution. When the conviction was overturned, old wounds were reopened. Questions about who was truly responsible remained unanswered. That uncertainty weighed heavily on all who had followed the case. Yet even in the midst of heartbreak, Ashley's memory inspired change. Lawmakers in Texas responded to her loss by creating stricter measures for monitoring sex offenders. These laws, known as Ashley's Laws, required more accountability and stronger oversight to protect children in the years that followed. Though the laws could not bring Ashley back, they stood as a safeguard for others, a way of ensuring that her life, though short, would continue to shape the world for good. For the Estell family, that legacy was bittersweet. They would always prefer to have Ashley with them, growing, laughing and living her life, but in her absence knowing that she had inspired actions for countless other children gave them something to hold on to. Her memory had become a guiding force, reminding others of the responsibility we all share in protecting the most vulnerable among us. Ashley's life was brief, but her impact stretched far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Ashley's story is one that rests heavy on the heart. At just 7 years old, she had already filled her family's lives with joy and her community with light. Her laughter, her energy, and her innocent presence were gifts that touched all who knew her. Though her life was cut short, the love she gave and received has never faded. Her case reminds us of the fragility of life and the way in which ordinary days, a soccer tournament, a Saturday afternoon, a family gathering, can sometimes hold within them the most unexpected turns. Ashley's disappearance and loss came suddenly, without warning, in a place where safety was assumed. That truth has stayed with the people of Plano for decades, shaping the way parents watch over their children and the way communities think about protection. Though justice in the courtroom proved complicated, Ashley's legacy reached beyond the trial. The laws created in her name became a lasting safeguard designed to protect children and families across Texas. In this way, her memory became more than a story of tragedy. It became a call to care for others, to build safer communities, and to ensure that her loss was not in vain. For her family, the ache of her absence remains, yet within their grief lies the knowledge that Ashley's name has carried forward into acts of protection and compassion. She is remembered not only as the child who was lost, but as the child whose memory has protected many others. The moral of her story is not one of fear, but of remembrance. It is a reminder that even short lives can carry immense meaning, and that love once given never disappears. Ashley's spirit lives on in the changes her life inspired, in the families she continues to safeguard, and in the hearts of all who speak her name with tenderness. And so, as we close Ashley's chapter, we do so gently. We remember her for the joy she brought, for the iconic and impact she left, and for the love that surrounds her still. Now let us turn softly to another story, another life, another memory, carried forward in the quiet of night. In the quiet town of Madisonville, Kentucky, life in the early 2000s moved at an unhurried pace. Nestled among rolling hills and close-knit neighborhoods, Madisonville was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where local businesses thrived on trust, and where family ties stretched deeply across generations. In this community lived Anna Mae Branson, a woman whose name carried weight not because of wealth or fame, but because of the steadiness of her presence. She was known as a sharp businesswoman, someone who worked hard and carried herself with quiet confidence. But beyond her professional reputation, Anna was remembered most for her warmth and kindness. Friends described her as dependable, a person who could be counted on to help when times were difficult. Her family saw her as a strong figure, a woman who balanced compassion with determination. Anna had built a life rooted in Madisonville. She had worked for years to create a sense of stability, both for herself and for those she loved. She was not someone who sought attention, but rather someone who earned respect simply by the way she lived. The choices she made reflected her values, honesty, loyalty, and the importance of looking after the people around her. Those who knew her often spoke of her ability to bring comfort. She carried herself with dignity, but also with approachability. In her presence, people felt at ease, knowing they were in the company of someone who listened, cared, and understood. By 2003, Anna was in her 60s. She had lived a life full of experiences, memories, and connections. To her family, she was more than just a relative. She was an anchor, someone whose love and guidance gave them strength. To her community, she was a respected figure, proof that integrity and kindness could leave a lasting mark. Her days were steady, filled with familiar routines, conversations, and the quiet rhythms of small-town life. It seemed she had created for herself a life of peace, surrounded by the people and places she cherished. Yet beneath the surface of that calm existence, unseen tensions were beginning to build. Though Anna herself lived with integrity, not all around her carried the same values, and soon the trust she extended to family would become the very thing that left her most vulnerable. In 2003, Anna Mae Branson was enjoying the rhythm of her later years. She had worked hard throughout her life, and though she remained active, there was also a sense of comfort in the routines she had built. Her home in Madisonville was a place of calm, the kind of house where family members could stop by for a warm conversation, where neighbors felt welcome, and where life felt steady. But while Anna herself lived a life of order, not everyone close to her was moving with the same sense of stability. Within her own family, there were those who struggled. Her nephew, in particular, carried with him heavy burdens, the kind of troubles that can quietly grow into something larger if left unchecked. This nephew, who had once been just another member of her extended family, had begun to fall into the difficulties of debt. Gambling had taken hold of his life, pulling him into a cycle of loss and desperation. As the debts deepened, so did his worries. He found himself searching for ways out, but instead of seeking help, his thoughts turned toward darker paths. Anna, by nature, was trusting. Family ties meant something to her. She believed in loyalty, in the bond between relatives, and in the idea that kindness should always be given to those closest to you. It is possible that she did not see the full weight of the struggles her nephew carried, or if she did, she may have believed he would find a way forward without harm. But for her nephew, desperation was growing. He saw in Anna not just a relative who cared for him, but also a woman who had built a life of stability and resources. In his troubled mind, those resources became something to covet. Instead of admiration, his thoughts shifted toward envy. Instead of gratitude, his heart turned toward betrayal. It was a quiet build-up, unseen by most. To Anna, her life appeared much the same. Conversations with family, small, errands in town, evenings spent at home. Yet in the background a storm was forming. The nephew she may have once trusted was beginning to see her not as family but as an answer to his problems. And in that silent shift, the path toward tragedy was set. The autumn of 2003 settled quietly over Madisonville. The town moved at its usual pace, with people preparing for cooler evenings and the calm routines of small-town life. To many, it was an ordinary season, filled with family dinners, familiar streets, and conversations exchanged in passing. For Anna Mae Branson, those days were no different. She spent her time in the ways she always had, tending to her home, speaking with loved ones, and living with the steady dignity that had long defined her. She had no reason to expect that anything would interrupt the peace she had built around herself. But one day, that peace was broken. Behind the walls of her home, where she should have been safe, Anna's life came to an end. It was not the result of illness, nor the natural passing of time. Instead, it was a sudden act, carried out by the very person she might have once trusted, her own nephew. The details of that day remain too heavy to dwell on closely. What matters most is that a woman who had lived with kindness and care was taken from the world too soon. The quiet rhythm of her home gave way to stillness, the kind that leaves behind unanswered questions and a weight of sorrow that settles deeply on those left behind. When her absence was noticed, the news travelled quickly. Friends and family who expected to see Anna or to hear her familiar voice were instead met with silence. Neighbours grew concerned, calls went unanswered, and when the truth was revealed, the community of Madisonville felt the sharp ache of loss. It was not just that Anna had died. It was the way in which she had been taken, and the fact that trust within her own family had been broken. To those who knew her, the thought was unbearable. A woman who had given her life to others, who had shown compassion and strength, had been betrayed by someone who should have loved and respected her most. Her passing left a deep void. For her family, it was a wound of both grief and disbelief. For the town, it was a reminder that even in the safest places, tragedy can unfold quietly, without warning. In the days following Anna's passing, Madisonville grew quiet with grief. A woman who had been such a steady presence was gone, and the weight of her absence was felt deeply. Friends came by her home, standing on the porch in disbelief. Family members gathered, their conversations subdued, their hearts heavy with sorrow. At first there was confusion. The community searched for understanding, wondering what had happened within the familiar walls of Anna's home. Some believed it might have been a robbery, the work of a stranger who had taken advantage of her kindness. Others whispered about accidents, or possibilities that seemed easier to bear than the truth. But as investigators entered her home, they began to notice signs that something more complex had taken place. There were small details that did not match the idea of a random crime. Things that should have been taken were left behind. patterns in the scene seemed to suggest familiarity, as though the person who had harmed Anna knew her and knew her home. Attention began to shift toward those closest to her. Investigators spoke with family, listening carefully, comparing stories, and quietly considering whether someone within her circle might have played a role. It was an unthinkable idea, yet it was one that evidence quietly supported. Her nephew, who had once shared in the warmth of her family gatherings, quickly came under suspicion. His debts were known to some, his gambling a burden that he carried heavily. And while many struggled to imagine that family could harm family, the pieces slowly began to point in his direction. For those who loved Anna, this possibility was almost too painful to accept. The thought that betrayal had come not from a stranger, but from someone within her family, deepened their grief. Trust, once taken for granted, had been broken in the most heartbreaking way. The discovery of the sang. His truth did not arrive all at once. It unfolded gently, layer by layer, as investigators pieced together evidence and motives. But with each step, the picture grew clearer. Anna's passing was not the result of chance or accident. It was the result of a deliberate act carried out by someone she should have been able to trust. And with that realization, the sorrow of Madisonville deepened further still. Once suspicion began to focus on Anna's nephew, investigators in Madisonville worked carefully to build their case. They knew the weight of such an accusation. It is never easy to suggest that harm has come from within a family, and detectives understood that proof would need to be strong, clear, and undeniable. They returned to Anna's home, examining each detail again with fresh eyes. They spoke with neighbors, asking if anyone had noticed unusual comings and goings. Some remembered seeing her nephew in the area around the time of her death. Others recalled hearing bits of conversation about his debts and the pressure he was under. Piece by piece, a picture of motive began to form. Financial records told more of the story. His gambling habits had left him desperate, and the weight of what he owed seemed to grow heavier with each passing day. Investigators could see how his difficulties had led him to think of Anna not as the aunt who loved him, but as a possible solution to his problems. It was a thought that, in his desperation, he had acted upon. When police sought to bring him in, they discovered that he had fled. Instead of staying in Kentucky, he had left the country, moving quickly in an attempt to escape the truth closing in around him. His flight only deepened the suspicion and strengthened the case against him. For investigators, his leaving was not just an inconvenience, it was confirmation that he knew what he had done and that he feared the consequences. The search for him stretched beyond state lines, beyond even national borders. Law enforcement worked with persistence, reaching out to agencies abroad, determined not to let Anna's story end without accountability. Months passed, but the case did not go cold. Detectives in Madisonville continued to follow the trail, keeping Anna's memory close as they pressed forward. Through their efforts, he was eventually located and brought back to face justice. For investigators, this was a quiet victory, not a celebration, but a moment of relief. They had promised in their own way to speak for Anna, to ensure that her story was heard and that her loss was not hidden in silence. Step by step, their work brought the truth closer to the light. When Anna's nephew was finally returned to Kentucky, the community of Madisonville felt a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief because the long wait for accountability was nearing an end. Sorrow because the truth had already shown itself that the person who had harmed Anna was not a stranger but a family member. The courtroom became the setting where those truths were laid bare. Prosecutors presented the evidence carefully. They spoke of his gambling debts, his growing desperation, and the way he had seen Anna's stability as a way out of his own troubles. They showed the timeline of his actions, the details that placed him in her home, and the choices he made afterward to flee and escape responsibility. For the jury, the story was painful to hear. They were asked to consider not just the facts of the case, but also the betrayal that lay within it. Family is meant to be a source of protection, a place of trust. To hear how that trust had been broken so completely weighed heavily on everyone present. The defense, too, told its story, asking the jury to consider his struggles, his desperation, and his state of mind. But no explanation could lessen the grief of what had happened to Anna, nor could it undo the choice he had made. In the end, the jury returned its verdict: guilty. The weight of justice settled in the courtroom as sentencing followed. There was no joy in the decision, no celebration, only a quiet recognition that Anna's life had been honored by the truth being spoken aloud. For her family, the trial was both a painful and necessary step. To sit in that courtroom, to hear the details spoken, was heartbreaking. Yet it also offered a measure of peace, the knowledge that her story had not been forgotten and that the law had recognized the wrong that had been done. The trial marked the end of one chapter, but it did not erase the ache of loss. Anna was still held gone. Her laughter, her wisdom, her kindness, all remained only in memory. But through the process of justice, the community of Madisonville could at last begin to breathe a little easier, knowing that truth had found its way forward. When the trial came to a close and the verdict was delivered, Madisonville was left in a state of reflection. Justice had been served, yet the emotions that followed were layered and complex. For Anna's family, there was some comfort in knowing that the truth had been spoken and accountability had been reached. But alongside that comfort lived a deep and unshakable grief. Anna had been more than a family member. She was a source of strength, the kind of person others leaned on in times of need. Her passing left a void that no verdict, no sentence could ever fill. Family gatherings, once warmed by her presence, now felt quieter. Her laughter, her wisdom, her steady guidance were missing, and those who loved her were left to carry her memory instead of her company. The betrayal added another layer of pain. To lose a loved one is heartbreaking. To lose them at the hands of another family member is something almost impossible to understand. For Anna's relatives, the sorrow was not only in her absence, but in the breaking of trust that had once connected them all. That truth weighed heavily, leaving scars that would take years to heal. The community of Madisonville felt the loss, too. Anna was not just a private figure, she was someone people respected, admired, and depended on. Her absence rippled outward, felt in the businesses she had touched, in the friendships she had nurtured, and in the simple interactions she had each day with her neighbors. Her passing became a reminder of both the strength and the fragility of trust. Yet even within the sadness, there was resilience. Friends and family spoke her name, told her stories, and carried forward the lessons she had taught through the way she lived. Her kindness became her legacy, remembered not just in sorrow, but in gratitude. Over time, the community learned to balance the weight of grief with the strength of memory. Anna's life, though ended in betrayal, was remembered for far more than its final chapter. She was remembered for the decades of love, generosity, and dignity that came before. The story of Anna Mae Branson is one that speaks quietly of love, of trust, and of the sorrow that comes when that trust is broken. She was a woman who gave her life to her family, her work, and her community. Those who knew her remembered her strength, her kindness, and her ability to bring comfort in times of need. Though her life ended in tragedy, her legacy remains far greater than the circumstances of her passing. Her case reminds us that betrayal, though painful, does not erase love. Even when trust is shattered, the memory of compassion, warmth, and dignity cannot be taken away. Anna's life was defined not by the betrayal of one family member, but by decades of steady presence, of quiet acts of generosity, and of the ways she helped others feel seen and supported. In Madisonville, her absence was deeply felt, yet so too was her memory. Friends and family continued to honor her by sharing her stories, by remembering the way she laughed, the way she spoke with honesty, and the way she cared for those around her. In their grief, they found strength in holding on to the best of who she was. There is also a lesson here about resilience. Communities can experience sorrow, yet still find a way to move forward with gentleness. Families can face betrayal, yet still honor the memory of those they have lost. Anna's story is not only about the pain of her ending, but also about the enduring power of remembrance, the way her life continues to ripple outward long after she is gone. As we close her chapter, we do so softly, with respect. We remember Anna for her character, not for the crime, for the trust she gave, not for the way it was broken, and for the love she shared, which endures even now. Madisonville carried on, as small towns do. Seasons changed, people came and went, and life slowly settled into its familiar rhythm once more. But Anna's story remains, a quiet remnant that every life, no matter how it ends, carries meaning and deserves to be honored. Now we turn gently to our next story, another life, another memory waiting to be told. In the late 1990s, the city of Santa Rosa sat quietly among the rolling hills and vineyards of Northern California. It was a place where families built their lives in familiar neighborhoods, where children walked to school along tree-lined streets, and where the days often felt unhurried beneath the wide California sky. Among the families who lived there was a young girl named Georgia Leah Moses. At just 12 years old, Georgia carried with her a spirit that was both gentle and strong. Those who knew her described her as kind, caring, and protective, especially of her younger sister Angel. Though she was still a child herself, Georgia often took on the role of caregiver, guiding her sister with a sense of love that far exceeded her years. Her family life was not always easy. Her mother struggled with challenges that made it difficult at times to provide stability. In the middle of those difficulties, Georgia quietly stepped forward, doing what she could to bring comfort and care to her little sister. It was not a burden she should have had to carry, but she did so with love, because for Georgia, family came first. Friends remembered her smile, her curiosity, and the warmth she brought to those around her. She had dreams, as all children do. Dreams that were still forming, still unfolding. She was at the very beginning of her story, a young girl navigating childhood with hope in her heart and her sister's hand in her own. To Angel, Georgia was more than just a sibling. She was a protector, a source of comfort, and a reminder that love could be steady even when life felt uncertain. Their bond was deep, one built on trust and quiet acts of care. Wherever Georgia went, Angel was never far behind, her sister's presence making the world feel safer. By the summer of 1997, Georgia's life was full of the ordinary moments of childhood. School, friendships, laughter, and the irresponsibility of looking after her sister. She may have been young, but she carried herself with a strength that left an impression on everyone who met her. Her story, however, would soon be interrupted. And though her time was short, the love she gave and the life she lived continued to be remembered, not just by her family, but by an entire community that came to know her name. The summer of 1997 in Santa Rosa carried with it the familiar rhythm of warm days, long evenings, and the ordinary routines of families going about their lives. For many children, it was a time of play and carefree adventures, but for Georgia Leah Moses, the season carried responsibilities that reached far beyond her 12 years. Her mother, though loving, was struggling with her own challenges. This often left Georgia in a position where she became the one to care for her younger sister, Angel. At an age when she might have been free to think only of school and friends, Georgia was often the steady hand guiding her sister through daily life. She made sure Angel was fed, that she felt safe, and that she had someone to turn to when things became uncertain. To outsiders, it may have looked like too much responsibility for such a young girl, but for Georgia, it was simply what love required. She accepted her role quietly, with a sense of maturity that was striking for her age. Angel in turn adored her older sister, seeing her not just as a sibling but as a protector, someone who always put her needs first. The bond between the two sisters was unbreakable. They leaned on each other, filling in the gaps where life felt unsteady. In many ways, Georgia became the glue holding her small world together. She carried herself with patience, and even though she was only 12, those who knew her often remarked on her strength. But beneath her quiet resilience, Georgia was still a child, one who laughed, played, and dreamed of the future. She enjoyed music, she smiled often, and she found joy in simple moments. Her life, though filled with extra responsibility, was still marked by the innocence of youth. In the weeks before her disappearance, life carried on in its familiar way. Georgia looked after her sister, kept close to the people she trusted, and found moments of happiness in the midst of everyday challenges. To those around her, she was a reminder of how love and responsibility can coexist, even in someone so young. No one could have imagined that this summer, a season of warmth, ordinary days, and the closeness of two sisters, would be her last. In the final days of August 1997, the world of Georgia and her sister shifted in a way no one could have prepared for. What began as an ordinary stretch of summer days, warm air, familiar routines, and the steady closeness of the two sisters, soon gave way to a silence that would never be fully lifted. At just 12 years old, Georgia disappeared. One day she was present, filling her sister's world with the comfort of her care, and the next she was gone. For Angel, still so young, the absence was confusing and frightening. The girl who had always been her protector was no longer there to guide her. The community of Santa Rosa felt the weight of the news almost immediately. Word spread quickly that a young girl was missing, and the concern deepened with each hour she did not return. Families who heard of her disappearance held their own children close, reminded suddenly of the fragility of safety. Volunteers joined in the search, walking through neighborhoods, hoping to spot any sign of where Georgia might have gone. But as the days passed, that hope grew quieter. Then came the discovery no one wished for. Georgia had been killed. She would not be returning home to her sister, her family, or her community. The girl who had carried so much love and responsibility in her 12 short years was gone. The details of what happened to Georgia were painful, and investigators shared them only with care. What mattered most was not the manner of her death, but the impact of her loss. A child who had stepped so far into the role of caregiver, who had loved and protected her sister so fiercely, had been taken from the world before she had the chance to grow into the future she deserved. The stillness that followed was heavy. Her sister's small voice asking for her, the quiet grief of her community, and the sorrow of knowing her life had ended too soon left behind a wound that would not easily heal. Georgia's disappearance and death were not just events. They were turning points for all who knew her, moments that left behind an emptiness that could never truly be filled. When Georgia first went missing, there was hope, a fragile hope that perhaps she had wandered away and would soon return, perhaps staying with a friend or simply exploring a little farther than usual. But as the hours stretched into days, that hope grew fainter. Neighbors and friends searched nearby parks, sidewalks, and quiet corners of Santa Rosa. Volunteers looked along roadsides, checked playgrounds, and asked questions in shops and schools. Her younger sister Angel tried in her own way to make sense of what was happening, her young heart struggling to understand why her sister, the person who had always been by her side, was suddenly gone. When Georgia's body was discovered, the heartbreak was immediate and deep. The quiet community, once filled with the simple rhythms of everyday life, was shaken. Parents who had once felt safe letting their children play outdoors now pulled them closer. Families who had known Georgia felt the loss directly, while those who had only heard of her through the news felt sorrow that such a young life could be taken so suddenly. The discovery also raised questions that lingered without answers. How had this happened? Who was responsible? Why had Georgia, a girl so young and kind, been taken? Investigators looked carefully at the details, but the truth remained hidden, as if covered by shadows. For Angel, the discovery meant more than just loss. It meant growing up without the sister who had been her protector and guide. She was left with memories of laughter, of small acts of care, of the bond they shared. But the comfort of Georgia's presence was gone. The cover-up, if there was one, seemed to come from silence itself. No witness came forward with clear answers. No confession was given. Whoever had been responsible for her death left little trace, and the investigation soon became a difficult path filled with more questions than solutions. Georgia's discovery marked the end of the search, but not the end of her story. Instead, it became the beginning of a new journey. One of grief for her family, of determination for investigators, and of remembrance for a community that would never forget her name. From the moment Georgia was reported missing, investigators in Santa Rosa worked with urgency. A missing child case is always approached with the greatest seriousness, and when her body was later discovered, the weight of responsibility only deepened. Detectives began piecing together her final days, trying to understand where she had been, who she had been with, and how her life had been taken. They spoke with neighbors, friends, and classmates, asking whether anyone had noticed unusual activity or unfamiliar faces in the area. They revisited her home life, knowing that children are most often vulnerable within the circles closest to them. They examined the place where she was found, searching for physical evidence that might point toward an answer. Every detail mattered. Every small clue might hold the key to solving the mystery. Despite their efforts, the investigation quickly became complicated. There were no clear witnesses, no straightforward path to follow. The silence surrounding Georgia's disappearance and death was profound, and investigators found themselves facing more questions than answers. Forensic tools at the time were limited compared to what is available today. DNA testing was still developing, and many of the methods detectives relied upon involved careful interviewing, community outreach, and building timelines. While these efforts painted parts of the picture, they never revealed the full truth. Over the years, the case was revisited many times. New detectives stepped in, determined to look at the evidence with fresh eyes. Tips were followed, potential suspects were considered, and possibilities were explored. But each time, the case seemed to slip back into silence, the answers remaining just beyond reach. The investigation became what is often called a cold case. It was not forgotten, but it lacked the momentum needed to move forward. Files we rekept, evidence preserved, and the hope remained that someday new technology or new information might bring resolution. For the investigators who worked on Georgia's case, the lack of answers was not just frustrating, and it was heartbreaking. They knew she was more than just a name on a file. She was a child, deeply loved, whose story deserved justice, and even as the years passed, her case remained open, waiting for the day when truth might finally step out of the shadows. For many families touched by tragedy, there comes a moment when justice finds its way into a courtroom, a suspect is named, evidence is presented, and a trial offers the chance for truth to be spoken aloud. But for Georgia Leah Moses, that moment never came. Despite the efforts of investigators, no one was ever charged with her death. The case remained unsolved, resting quietly in the files of law enforcement, carried forward only by the hope that one day new evidence might emerge. There was no confession, no clear suspect who admitted to wrongdoing, and so there was no trial. For Georgia's family, this absence was its own kind of heartbreak. To lose her was devastating, but to live without knowing who was responsible, or why, added another layer of pain. Her younger sister, Angel, who had been so close to her, grew up without answers. She carried the weight of uncertainty into her adulthood, longing for closure that never arrived. The community, too, struggled with the lack of resolution. When a crime remains unsolved, it leaves behind an uneasiness, a sense that something important has been left unfinished. In Santa Rosa, people spoke of Georgia with sorrow, but also with the quiet frustration that her story had no conclusion. Over the years, tips would occasionally surface. Leads were followed, suspects considered, but none ever led to the moment of accountability that her loved ones longed for. The absence of a confession or trial meant that Georgia's name remained tied not to justice, but to mystery. Yet even without a courtroom to mark the path of justice, her story continued to live on. The very fact that the case remained open, that investigators refused to close the file, that her sister refused to stop speaking her name, was its own kind of testimony. It showed that while the system had not yet delivered answers, love and memory were powerful forces that could not be silenced. For Georgia, there was no trial to define the end of her story, but in the hearts of those who remembered her, she remained present, her life honored in quiet ways, her memory carried forward despite the absence of resolution. The years that followed Georgia's passing carried with them a quiet sorrow. For her family, the loss was not just of a 12-year-old girl, but of the light she brought into their lives each day. Her sister Angel, so young at the time, grew up with a space in her heart that could never be filled. Georgia had been her protector, her guide, and her closest companion. Without her, Angel was left to navigate the world without the comfort of her sister's hand in her own. As Angel grew older, she carried Georgia's memory with her. She spoke about her sister with tenderness, ensuring that her story was never forgotten. In many ways, she became Georgia's voice, the one who could remind the world that her sister had lived, had laughed, had loved, and had mattered deeply. Through Angel's words and advocacy, Georgia's presence continued to ripple outward even decades after her passing. For the community of Santa Rosa, the emotional aftermath was also profound. The city, though known for its beauty and calm, held within it the memory of a tragedy that remained unresolved. Parents often thought of Georgia when they looked at their own children, reminded of how precious and fragile young lives can be. Teachers, neighbors, and friends remembered her smile, her kindness, and the maturity she carried even at such a young age. The lack of closure left many unsettled. It is difficult to heal when questions remain unanswered, when justice feels incomplete. Yet out of that uncertainty, people found a way to honor her life instead of focusing solely on her death. Community members shared stories, spoke her name, and reminded one another of the strength she had shown in caring for her sister. Angel, in particular, became the keeper of that memory. She has spoken in interviews, written tributes, and carried Georgia's legacy forward with grace. Though her own childhood was shaped by grief, she transformed that pain into a source of remembrance, ensuring that her sister's story continues to live on. The aftermath of Georgia's loss was heavy, but it also revealed the resilience of love. Even when justice does not arrive, memory and devotion can keep someone alive in the hearts of many. Georgia's life was short, but the love she gave, and the love returned to her, has proven to endure. The story of Georgia Leah Moses is one that lingers softly in the memory, not because of the details of her loss, but because of the strength of her love. At only 12 years old, she carried responsibilities far beyond her years, yet she bore them with grace. She looked after her sister, gave warmth to those around her, and filled her short life with acts of care that revealed the depth of her heart. Though her case remains unsolved and no trial or confession ever brought answers, Georgia's life is not defined by that absence. Instead, it is defined by the way she is remembered. Her sister Angel carries her name forward, speaking of her with tenderness, ensuring that she is never forgotten. Friends and neighbors, too, recall her smile, her kindness, and the quiet maturity that made her stand out even as a child. The moral of Georgia's story is not one of despair, but of remembrance. It reminds us that even when justice is delayed, or when answers remain hidden, the value of a life does not diminish. Love continues to speak, even when silence surrounds the facts. Memory itself becomes a form of justice, a way of saying that her life mattered and will always matter. Communities often find themselves changed by tragedies such as these. In Santa Rosa, Georgia's name became a gentle reminder of the importance of looking after one another, of caring for children who may be carrying burdens unseen. Her story encourages us to notice, to listen, and to extend kindness wherever it is needed. For Angel, Georgia's legacy is deeply personal. Every word she speaks about her sister keeps that bond alive, bridging the gap between past and present. Through her, Georgia's love continues to touch others, even decades later. As we close this chapter, we hold Georgia in our thoughts, not as a mystery left unsolved, but as a child whose love and resilience remain powerful. She may be gone, but her story continues to remind us of the strength of memory and the way love endures. And now we move softly forward to another life, another story carried on the quiet breeze of remembrance. In Jefferson County, Missouri, in the summer of 2005, life moved at its usual gentle pace. Families gathered for barbecues, children played in yards beneath the August sun, and neighbors waved to one another as they passed along familiar country roads. It was a community where people felt grounded, where connections between families stretched across years, and where daily life seemed steady. Within this setting lived Amanda Jones, a young woman of 26. She was remembered as kind, gentle, and deeply devoted to her family. Friends described her as someone who carried herself with warmth, the type of person who made others feel comfortable in her presence. She was soft-spoken, yet strong, and her kindness left an impression on all who knew her. At the time, Amanda was expecting a child. Her pregnancy had brought her both hope and uncertainty, but above all, she looked forward to the arrival of her baby. Her family surrounded her with support, helping her prepare for the new chapter in her life. To them, she was not only a daughter, a sister, and a friend, but soon she would be a mother, a role she was ready to embrace with love. Amanda's life was not extraordinary in the eyes of the wider world, but to those who knew her, she was extraordinary in all the ways that mattered. She was steady, dependable, and loving. Her story, however, would soon take a turn that no one expected, leaving behind questions that still linger today. As her pregnancy progressed, Amanda remained hopeful about the future. In August of 2005, she arranged to meet with the man believed to be the father of her unborn child. She hoped they could discuss the baby, their responsibilities, and what role he might play once the child was born. For Amanda, the meeting carried weight. It was a chance to bring clarity to a situation that had been uncertain. She was strong enough to face it directly, wide, yet gentle enough to hope for understanding. In her heart, she likely carried a mixture of emotions, hope that her child would be supported and concern about whether the father would accept his responsibilities. Her family knew about the meeting and they supported her decision. Amanda believed in facing life with honesty, and this conversation was a part of that. She wanted to secure a future not just for herself, but for her child. On that August day, Amanda set out with determination. She drove to the agreed meeting place in Jefferson County, her thoughts focused on the life she carried and the conversations ahead. It was a warm summer afternoon, filled with the ordinary hum of life around her. Nothing about the day suggested it would be her last. Amanda arrived at the meeting spot and was last seen alive there. She met with the man she had trusted enough to share the news of her pregnancy. From that moment forward, Amanda's story fell into silence. When she did not return home, her family grew worried. At first they hoped for a delay, perhaps a longer conversation than expected. But as hours passed and Amanda remained absent, worry deepened into fear. Her car was found parked where she had last been seen. Inside, her belongings were left behind, yet Amanda herself was gone. The discovery was haunting. Her absence was immediate and unexplained. A young woman, heavily pregnant, had vanished in broad daylight. The world that had seemed steady only hours before now felt fragile and uncertain. Her family's hearts sank with the weight of what this meant. Amanda had never been the kind of person to disappear without contact. She was responsible, loving, and dependable. Her absence spoke not of choice, but of something far more troubling. Though her body was never recovered, investigators and family members came to understand that Amanda's life had been taken that day. The child she carried, too, was lost. It was not only the loss of one life, but two, and the sorrow of that reality would linger for years to come. As soon as Amanda was reported missing, the search began. Family members, friends and neighbors spread out across Jefferson County, walking fields, checking wooded areas, and calling her name into the quiet air. Police joined them, carefully retracing her steps, hoping to uncover where she had gone after arriving at the meeting. The discovery of her car was a turning point. Parked in plain sight, it was a sign that Amanda had never left the area on her own. The vehicle became a symbol of unanswered questions, a silent witness to her final moments. Attention turned quickly to the man she had gone to meet. He was the last person to see her alive, and his unwillingness to provide clear answers deepened suspicions. Yet without Amanda's body, the investigation faced obstacles. Proof was harder to establish, and the silence of the scene left investigators struggling to fill the gaps. Her family, meanwhile, held on to each other as they faced the reality of her disappearance. They placed their trust in the community and in law enforcement, hoping that the truth would be uncovered and that Amanda would be found. The police worked tirelessly to uncover the truth about Amanda's disappearance. Detectives interviewed witnesses, combed through timelines, and studied every available piece of evidence. Their focus remained on the man Amanda had met that day, whom they believed bore responsibility for what had happened to her. Though the evidence was largely circumstantial, it painted a troubling picture. His behavior before and after the meeting raised questions. His unwillingness to cooperate fully with investigators only deepened their suspicions. Despite their efforts, the absence of Amanda's body meant the investigation could not move as quickly as many hoped. Prosecutors hesitated, knowing that a courtroom requires proof beyond doubt. Without Amanda, the case lacked the clarity needed to proceed. Still, law enforcement never let go of the file. They carried it year after year, always ready to revisit it with new technology, new perspectives, or new witnesses. Amanda's story remained open in their hearts, a promise that they would not forget her. In many cases, a trial marks the path toward resolution. But for Amanda's story, that moment never came. The man she had met that day remained the primary suspect, but no confession was ever made, and no charges were filed before his death years later. His passing meant that the possibility of accountability through the courts was lost. Whatever answers he carried with him were buried in silence. For Amanda's family, this was a second heartbreak. Not only had they lost her, but they had also lost the chance to face the truth in a courtroom, to hear justice spoken aloud. The absence of a trial left her story unresolved. The questions remained. What exactly had happened in those final moments, and why? Without him to speak, those questions linger in the quiet of memory, unanswered but never forgotten. For Amanda's family, the years that followed were marked by grief and resilience. They had not only lost a daughter and sister, but also the child she had carried with such hope. 2 lives filled with promise had been cut short in a single afternoon. Family gatherings were forever changed. Holidays, birthdays, and ordinary days alike carried the ache of her absence. Yet even in their sorrow, her loved ones spoke her name, told her stories, and ensured that Amanda remained present in memory. The community of Jefferson County shared in the grief. Many had known Amanda personally, while others simply felt the tragedy deeply because it had happened so close to home. People came together to offer comfort, and in doing so, they carried her memory forward. For her family, there was also the quiet determination to keep her story alive. They hoped that by remembering her, by sharing her life and her loss, others might feel inspired to protect those they love, to face life's uncertainties with courage, and to extend compassion wherever it is needed. Amanda's story is one of hope interrupted, of love carried forward, and of memory that endures. At just 26, she was preparing to welcome a child, to begin a new chapter of life. Her disappearance and presumed death left behind questions that may never be fully answered. Yet what remains clear is the love she gave, the life she lived, and the impact she left on those around her. Her case reminds us of the importance of compassion, of holding our loved ones close, and of cherishing each ordinary day. Though justice in the legal sense never arrived, Amanda's memory remains powerful. She is remembered by her family, her community, and by all who hear her story. Her life, though cut short, continues to matter. And in speaking her name, in remembering her with gentleness, we honor not only her, but the child she carried. To live is gone, but never forgotten. And now, softly, we turn to our next story. Another life, another memory, another truth carried quietly through time. In the mid-1980s, the town of Warner Robins, Georgia, was a community rooted in the rhythms of small-town life. Families gathered for Friday night football games, neighbors greeted one another on front porches, and children filled the streets with the sound of laughter as they rode bikes and played with friends. It was a place where people felt safe, where childhood often unfolded with a sense of freedom and trust. Among those children was Charles Chuckie Mauk. At 13 years old, Chuckie was full of energy and curiosity. He was known as a boy who loved to be outdoors, exploring his neighborhood and spending time with friends. He had a wide smile that reflected his easy spirit, and he carried with him the sense of adventure that often defines youth. To his family, Chuckie was more than just a child. He was a son, a brother, and a friend who filled their lives with laughter. He had a kindness about him, a way of making people feel at ease, and he lived the kind of childhood that many remember fondly. Afternoons of play, evenings of simple joys, and the innocence of a boy who still had so much life ahead of him. By February of 1986, Chuckie's days were filled with school, time with friends, and the ordinary adventures of early adolescence. He had dreams for the future, though they were still forming, as they so often are at that age. To those who loved him, it seemed certain that his life was just beginning. But in the span of a single evening, that sense of safety and promise would be broken. Chuckie's story, once so full of light, would be interrupted in a way that left his family and his community carrying the weight of grief for decades to come. On February 17, 1986, Chuckie spent the evening like so many other boys his age. He was out on his bicycle, riding through the familiar streets of Warner Robins. The air was cool, carrying the quiet of an ordinary winter night. Chuckie pedaled along comfortably, enjoying the freedom that came with having a bike and the trust of his family to ride near his neighborhood. For his parents, there was little reason to worry. Warner Robins was not a place where danger seemed close at hand. Children often played outdoors until dusk, their laughter echoing through the streets before returning home for dinner. That evening felt no different, until it suddenly was. As Chuckie rode, he was seen stopping near a convenience store not far from his home. Witnesses later remembered him speaking with someone in a car, though the details were vague and difficult to confirm. In that small, ordinary moment, a boy on his bike pausing to talk, the seeds of tragedy were quietly set. The presence of a stranger, or perhaps someone Chuckie knew only slightly, was enough to shift the safety of the evening into something far more uncertain. Though no one realized it at the time, Chuckie's last ride was already unfolding. The build-up to his disappearance was subtle. Nothing seemed obviously wrong. There was no commotion, no alarm, no clear sign that danger had entered the picture. It was a moment that blended into the background of an ordinary evening, unnoticed by most, yet it would change everything for those who loved him. Later that night, Chuckie did not return home. His absence at first may have seemed like a small delay, a boy lingering a little too long on his bike ride. But when time stretched on and Chuckie still did not appear, worry set in. His family began to search, calling his name into the quiet night air. The truth, when it was discovered, was heartbreaking. Chuckie had been shot once in the back of the head while riding his bicycle. His body was found not far from the convenience store where he had last been seen. The stillness of that scene contrasted sharply with the energy he had carried only hours earlier. For his family, the realization was devastating. A boy so full of life, taken in a moment of senseless violence, left behind only silence. His bicycle, once a symbol of freedom and joy, became a haunting reminder of his final moments. The murder of a child is always a tragedy, but in a community like Warner Robins, it was unthinkable. Families who had once felt secure now looked upon their quiet streets with unease. Parents held their children closer, wondering how such a thing could happen in a place that had always felt safe. Chuckie's life, full of promise, had been cut short. The boy who loved to explore, to laugh, to play, was gone, leaving behind a void that could never be filled. The discovery of Chuckie's death left investigators with a haunting mystery. Who had harmed a 13-year-old boy and why? The scene offered few answers. His bike was found nearby, undisturbed, suggesting that robbery was not the motive. The single gunshot spoke of a deliberate act, yet no one knew who had pulled the trigger. Witnesses recalled seeing Chuckie near a car, but the details were uncertain. Some believed it was a white or light-coloured vehicle, possibly driven by a young man, but descriptions varied and memory can be fragile under stress. Investigators were left with fragments of information, none of them strong enough to form a complete picture. The lack of clarity was deeply troubling. If the killer had tried to cover up their crime, they had done so by leaving little behind. No clear fingerprints, no obvious evidence, no confession to guide the search. The case grew complicated almost immediately. For the Mauk family, the discovery meant their lives had been forever altered. They were thrust into a world of questions without answers, of sorrow without resolution. The community too felt the weight of the tragedy. The loss of Chuckie was not just a private grief. It was a communal one, felt by neighbours, classmates and friends who could not comprehend how such violence had found its way into their town. Detectives in Warner Robins pursued every lead they could find. They interviewed witnesses who had seen Chuckie that evening, asking for every possible detail. They studied the crime scene, searching for clues that might have been overlooked. They considered the possibility of strangers passing through, as well as the painful thought that someone from the community itself might have been involved. The investigation stretched on for months, then years. Tips came in, sometimes offering hope, only to fade when the information proved unreliable. The car that witnesses reported seeing became the focus of many searches, but no suspect was ever firmly tied to it. As time passed, the case grew colder. Detectives who had carried it in the early days eventually retired, leaving the file to new investigators who revisited the evidence with fresh eyes. Yet despite decades of effort, Chuckie's killer was never identified. The lack of closure weighed heavily on the police, who spoke often of their determination to keep the case alive, hoping that one day technology or a witness might break the silence. Unlike many cases, there was no confession, no trial, and no resolution for Chuckie's murder. The absence of answers left his family with a grief that was both sharp and unending. Without accountability, the wound remained open. Over the years, rumours surfaced. Some believed they knew who was responsible, but without evidence strong enough for court, no charges were ever filed. Others thought it may have been a case of mistaken identity or a random act of violence, but none of these theories could be proven. For Chuckie's parents, siblings and friends, the absence of justice was its own kind of cruelty. They longed not only for answers, but for the simple recognition of the truth. Without a trial, they were left with only memories and the quiet hope that someday, somehow, clarity would come. The emotional aftermath of Chuckie's loss stretched far beyond his family. For the community of Warner Robins, the murder of a 13-year-old boy shattered the sense of safety they had long cherished. Parents became more cautious, children were kept closer, and the innocence of the town felt forever changed. Chuckie's family carried the grief most deeply. Each birthday that passed without him, each holiday where his presence was missed, was a reminder of all that had been taken. He was remembered not for the way he died, but for the way he lived, his smile, his laughter, his kindness. His memory became a source of both sorrow and comfort. In classrooms, his absence was felt by friends who had once shared desks and playgrounds with him. As they grew older, they carried his memory into adulthood, never forgetting the boy whose life had ended too soon. The community held vigils, shared stories, and kept his name alive. For them, Chuckie was more than a victim. He was a child whose life had meaning and whose story deserved to be remembered. Chuckie Mauk's story is one of Inno's, Kent interrupted, of a life full of promise cut short. Though his case remains unsolved, his memory endures. He is remembered not for the mystery surrounding his death, but for the joy he brought in life. The boy on a bicycle, the laughter he carried, the kindness he shared. His story reminds us of the fragility of safety and the importance of cherishing each moment with those we love. It is also a reminder of persistence, that even when justice feels far away, memory itself can be a form of truth. By remembering Chuckie, by speaking his name, his life continues to matter. Warner Robins carries his story as part of its history, a quiet thread woven into the fabric of the community, and his family, though burdened by grief, continues to hold him close in their hearts. As we close this chapter, we do so gently, remembering Chuckie not as a case but as a child, loved, missed, and never forgotten. And now, softly, we turn to the next story. Another life, another memory carried quietly through time. Burke County, North Carolina in the early 1980s was a place of rolling foothills and winding roads. The community, surrounded by the gentle rise of the Appalachian Mountains, lived at a slower pace. Families gathered often, neighbors knew one another by name, and young people grew up in an atmosphere where everyone seemed connected in some way. It was the kind of town where traditions ran deep and change came quietly, if at all. In this close-knit setting lived 19-year-old Rhonda Hinson. She was remembered as bright, thoughtful, and dependable. Friends described her as someone who was always willing to lend a hand, while family spoke of her as a loving daughter whose presence brought light into their home. Her smile was warm and genuine, a reflection of the kindness she carried in her heart. Rhonda had recently graduated from high school, stepping into the first stages of adulthood. She was working as a clerk at a local steel company, saving money while considering what direction her future might take. Like many young women her age, she balanced responsibility with the joys of youth. She enjoyed evenings with friends, the freedom of driving her own car, and the anticipation of what life might hold for her just beyond the horizon. Her parents, Bobby and Judy, were proud of the young woman she was becoming. They supported her independence while cherishing the close relationship they shared with her. Rhonda was not just their child, but a source of pride and joy, someone they believed had a bright and steady path ahead. By December 1981, the holiday season was in full swing. Rhonda attended Christmas parties, laughing with friends and enjoying the spirit of the season. It was a time of warmth, connection, and celebration. But just before Christmas, her life was interrupted in a way no one could have anticipated. The events of that night would leave her family and her community with questions that, even decades later, remain unanswered. The evening of December 22, 1981, carried the feeling of the holidays. Rhonda had joined her friends for a Christmas party, a gathering filled with music, laughter, and the kind of joy that comes from being young and surrounded by those you trust. She wore a smile that night, enjoying herself in the company of people who cared about her. As the evening wound down, Rhonda made plans to head home. She had responsibilities the next day, and she was the kind of person who balanced fun with responsibility. Though the party was lively, she decided to leave around midnight, beginning the drive back to her family's home. In those days, the roads in Burke County were quiet after dark. Street lights were sparse, and much of the landscape was rural, winding roads bordered by trees and fields. Rhonda drove her small car confidently, familiar with the route. For her, there was no reason to be afraid. She had traveled these roads many times before. But beneath the quiet surface of that December night, something else was happening. Whether it was someone following her or an encounter that took place unexpectedly along her drive, the safety of her journey home was disrupted. For reasons that remain unclear even now, Rhonda's final ride home became the beginning of a mystery that has lasted for more than 4 decades. Unbeknownst to her family waiting at home, the ordinary act of driving back after a Christmas party would mark the end of her life. The build-up to that moment was unremarkable in its details. A party, a drive, a familiar route. Yet within those ordinary steps, tragedy quietly took shape. Shortly after midnight, as Rhonda drove home from the Christmas party, her car came to a stop along a rural stretch of road. Exactly what happened in those moments is not fully known, but what is certain is that she was not alone. At some point during her drive, Rhonda was shot through the trunk of her car. The single bullet struck her, ending her life instantly. Her vehicle rolled gently down an embankment, coming to rest quietly off the side of the road. There was no commotion, no crash loud enough to draw attention, only the silent ending of a young life. In the stillness of the night, her car sat unnoticed until it was discovered later. For her family, the hours that followed were filled with confusion and worry. When Rhonda did not arrive home, her parents' concern grew quickly. It was unlike her to be late without a call, and they sensed almost immediately that something was wrong. When they learned of the discovery of her car, their worst fears began to take shape. The suddenness of her death was devastating. There had been no warning, no chance to prepare. A young woman full of promise, returning from a night of celebration, was gone in an instant. The mystery of how and why it happened only deepened the pain. For the community, the shock was profound. Burke County was not the kind of place where such violence seemed possible. A shooting on a quiet road in the middle of the night was almost unthinkable. Parents looked at their own children with worry, realizing how fragile safety could be, even in a place that felt so familiar. Rhonda's passing left behind silence where her laughter had been, and questions where certainty had once existed. The discovery of Rhonda's car in the early hours of December 23rd was the beginning of a long and painful mystery. Investigators arrived at the scene, examining the vehicle where it had come to rest at the bottom of a small embankment. At first glance, there was little to explain what had happened. There were no obvious signs of robbery, no indication of a crash that might have caused her death. As they looked closer, the truth began to reveal itself. A single bullet hole was found in the trunk of her car. That bullet, fired from behind, had traveled through the trunk and struck Rhonda, ending her life as she drove. The realization was chilling. This had not been an accident, but a deliberate act, yet there were no clear signs of who had been responsible. No witnesses had seen the shooting. The roads had been quiet, and the darkness of night concealed much. Whoever fired the shot had disappeared into the silence, leaving behind only questions. Rumors began to spread through the community. Some believed Rhonda may have been followed home from the party. Others wondered if it had been someone she knew, someone close enough to anticipate her route that night. With each theory came more questions, but no firm answers. For her parents, the discovery was unbearable. The news of her death, coupled with the mystery surrounding it, left them reeling. They had to face the reality that their daughter's life had been taken, yet they were given no clarity about why or by whom. The cover-up, if there was one, was simple and effective. Silence. Whoever had fired that shot left nothing behind to trace, no confession, no explanation. And with that silence, the story of Rhonda's death became one of the most haunting mysteries in Burke County's history. Investigators in Burke County devoted themselves to solving Rhonda's case. They spoke with friends who had seen her at the Christmas party that night, hoping someone might recall a detail that would point them in the right direction. They retraced her route, looking for any clue, no matter how small, that could explain what had happened. The bullet was analyzed, the angle studied, and the circumstances debated. Some believed it was a random act, perhaps someone testing a gun along the roadside. Others were convinced it was deliberate, that Rhonda had been followed or targeted. Without clear evidence, both possibilities remained open. Detectives examined her relationships, searching for any sign of tension or conflict that might have led to harm. They spoke with co-workers, friends, and acquaintances. While theories emerged, none provided the certainty investigators needed. Over the years, the case was revisited many times. New detectives would take up the file, hoping to see something that others had missed. Advances in forensic science brought hope, but the passage of time made the search more difficult. Witness memories faded, physical evidence grew older, and the trail seemed to grow colder with each passing year. Despite the challenges, law enforcement never gave up. They kept the case open, a constant reminder of their commitment to Rhonda and her family. Even decades later, detectives continue to speak of her story, determined to one day uncover the truth. Unlike some cases where the truth eventually surfaces, Rhonda's case never reached a courtroom. No suspect was ever charged and no confession was ever given. Her story remained suspended in uncertainty, without the resolution that her family longed for. There were times when investigators believed they were close. Suspects were considered, questioned, and studied, but without evidence strong enough to withstand the demands of trial, the case remained just beyond reach. The absence of closure became its own kind of sorrow. For her parents, each year that passed without justice was a painful reminder of all that had been lost. They had to carry not only the grief of her absence, but also the weight of unanswered questions. In interviews, they spoke of their determination to keep her memory alive, to ensure that she was remembered not just as a victim, but as their daughter, a young woman full of life and potential. The lack of a trial meant that the community too was left unsettled. People wanted answers, but none came, and so the case became one of those haunting stories that linger unsolved yet unforgettable. The emotional aftermath of Rhonda's death was profound. For her parents, the loss was immeasurable. They had watched their daughter step into adulthood, only to see her life ended in a moment of senseless violence. Their home, once filled with her laughter and presence, was now marked by absence. Her friends, too, felt the loss deeply. They had shared school days, parties, and plans for the future with her. To know that her journey had ended so suddenly left them with grief that never fully faded. The community of Burke County carried the weight of her story for years. Her case became part of the town's collective memory, a reminder of how fragile life can be. Parents held their children closer, and young people looked at the world with a little less innocence. Despite the sorrow, Rhonda's life continued to be honoured. Vigils were held, her name was spoken, and her story was remembered in the hope that someday the truth would emerge. Her parents' love for her never dimmed, and through their dedication, Rhonda's memory remained alive. Rhonda Hinson's story is one of a life interrupted far too soon. At 19, she stood at the edge of adulthood, full of promise and hope. Her journey was cut short, leaving behind grief, mystery, and unanswered questions. Yet even in the absence of justice, her memory endures. She is remembered not for the way she died, but for the way she lived. As a kind daughter, a loyal friend, and a young woman whose presence touched many lives. Her story reminds us of the fragility of safety, the importance of treasuring every moment, and the enduring power of love. Though decades have passed, Rhonda's case remains open. Investigators continue to carry her file, her parents continue to speak her name, and her community continues to remember. In that remembrance lies a kind of justice, not in the courtroom, but in the heart. As we close her chapter, we do so gently, holding her in memory and honouring her for the life she lived. And now, softly, we turn to our next story. Another life, another memory, carried gently through time. Grand Forks, North Dakota, in 2003 was a community defined by wide skies, open landscapes, and the steady rhythm of a college town. Winters were long and harsh, yet there was comfort in the familiarity of daily life. On the campus of the University of North Dakota, students carried books across snow-dusted sidewalks, filling classrooms with the quiet hum of ambition. Among them was Katrina Sjodin, a 22-year-old student whose spirit radiated warmth. She was remembered as vibrant, ambitious, and deeply kind. Friends described her as someone who could light up a room simply by being in it. She had an easy laugh, a caring heart, and a natural ability to connect with people. Drew was studying graphic design and psychology, balancing creativity with curiosity about the human mind. Her professors admired her dedication, while her peers looked to her as a friend who was both dependable and inspiring. She was active, athletic, and loved the outdoors. She worked part-time at a department store, and her life carried the fullness of someone on the edge of adulthood, with dreams beginning to take shape. Her family, living in Minnesota, cherished her deeply. To them, Drew was not only a daughter and sister, but also a source of joy. She carried the love of her family with her wherever she went, speaking often of them, grounding her independence in the strength of those bonds. In late November of 2003, as the holiday season approached, Drew's life appeared bright with promise. She had goals for the future, friendships that sustained her, and the kind of energy that made those around her feel uplifted. She was the kind of young woman who left an impression on everyone she met. But within the span of one evening, her story would take a tragic turn. On a cold November day, Drew's life was interrupted in a way that sent shockwaves not only through her family and community, but the entire state. Her disappearance and death would not only bring sorrow, but would also spark conversations that reshaped the law and the way society thought about protection. On November 22, 2003, Drew spent the day as so many college students do, balancing her work shift with time for herself. She had just finished her job at a local mall and made her way to the parking lot in the late afternoon. The air was crisp with the cold of winter setting in, but the holiday season added a quiet warmth to the atmosphere. For Drew, there was no reason to expect anything unusual. The mall was a familiar place, and she had parked her car just outside, ready to make her way home after a long shift. She carried her cell phone, speaking with her boyfriend as she walked toward her car, sharing casual conversation. It was an ordinary moment, filled with the small details of daily life. But unseen by Drew, danger lingered nearby. Alfonso Rodriguez Jr., a man recently released from prison after serving time for prior assaults, was in the area. He was considered a high-risk offender, yet he had been released into the community. That day, he crossed paths with Drew in the parking lot. What followed was sudden. While still on the phone with her boyfriend, Drew's voice shifted. She said something that suggested fear, as though she sensed she was no longer safe. Then the call ended. The abruptness of that moment was the beginning of a nightmare. Drew's absence was noticed almost immediately. Her boyfriend, alarmed by the sudden silence, tried to reach her again but could not. When hours passed with no word, concern grew quickly. This was not like Drew. She was dependable, communicative, and responsible. For her to disappear without explanation was unthinkable. What began as an ordinary evening was now the start of a frantic search. A young woman who had been full of life only moments before was suddenly missing, and those who loved her were thrust into fear and confusion. Drew never returned home that night. When her friends and family realized she had vanished, the sense of dread was immediate. She was not the type to disappear voluntarily, and the circumstances surrounding her last known moments left little doubt that something terrible had happened. Her car was found in the mall parking lot, but Drew herself was gone. The belongings she carried, small, everyday items, remained untouched, as though she had been interrupted mid-step. The stillness of her vehicle contrasted with the energy she had carried only hours earlier. For her family, the hours stretched painfully into days. Each call that went unanswered deepened the fear that her disappearance was not temporary. Law enforcement mobilized quickly, understanding that time was critical in missing person cases, especially when foul play was suspected. In the days that followed, search parties were organized. Volunteers joined investigators in combing fields, wooded areas, and ditches along rural roads. The cold November air carried their voices as they called Drew's name, hoping for an answer, yet the search turned up nothing. As days became weeks, hope remained, but it was fragile. The likelihood that Drew had been taken against her will seemed certain, and the focus turned toward finding who had been responsible. The truth, when it emerged, confirmed those fears. Alfonso Rodriguez had abducted Drew from the mall parking lot that evening. She was taken against her will, her life stolen before she had the chance to fulfill her dreams. The young woman who had once filled classrooms and homes with laughter was gone. Her body would not be found until the spring of 2004, months after her disappearance in a remote area of Minnesota. For her family, the discovery was devastating, but it also brought an end to the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing. From the moment Drew was reported missing, investigators worked tirelessly. Her car was examined, her phone records were traced, and witnesses at the mall were interviewed. The discovery that her call had ended abruptly was a key detail, one that pointed to the likelihood of an abduction. Attention quickly turned toward possible suspects, and Alfonso Rodriguez came under suspicion. He was a registered sex offender with a history of violence, recently released from prison only months before. Investigators discovered that he had been in the area at the time of Drew's disappearance, and inconsistencies in his story only deepened their suspicions. Despite his attempts to deny involvement, the evidence mounted. Items connected to Drew were discovered in his possession, and his movements on the day of her disappearance aligned with the timeline of events. It became clear that Rodriguez had not acted randomly. He had targeted Drew, and his actions were deliberate. The search for Drew continued through the winter. Her family held on to hope, even as the weeks passed. They organized vigils, kept her name in the news, and refused to let her story fade. Their determination kept the case alive in the hearts of the community, ensuring that Drew was never forgotten. In April of 2004, Drew's body was finally discovered in a field near Crookston, Minnesota. The confirmation of her death was heartbreaking, yet it brought an end to the agonizing uncertainty that her family had endured. They now had the chance to lay her to rest, even as the grief of her loss weighed heavily on their hearts. The investigation into Drew's disappearance and death was one of the largest in North Dakota's history. Federal and state agencies joined local law enforcement in the effort, pooling resources and expertise. The FBI assisted in building a case, and investigators worked tirelessly to collect every piece of evidence that could link Alfonso Rodriguez to the crime. Rodriguez's past made him a central focus. He had a history of abductions and assaults, and though he had served time in prison, he had been released despite warnings that he posed a danger. The fact that he had been free to commit another crime so soon after his release raised questions about how such cases were managed. Forensic evidence, combined with witness accounts and Rodriguez's own behavior, built a strong case against him. Investigators pieced together the timeline, showing how Drew had been taken from the parking lot and how Rodriguez's movements that day aligned with her disappearance. The case revealed not only the tragedy of Drew's death, but also the larger issues surrounding public safety. The fact that a high-risk offender had been released without sufficient safeguards sparked outrage and fueled calls for reform. Alfonso Rodriguez was arrested and charged with Drew's abduction and murder. His trial became one of the most closely watched cases in North Dakota history. The evidence presented painted a devastating picture of what had happened that November evening. Rodriguez maintained his innocence, but the jury was unconvinced. The prosecution showed how his history of violence, combined with the evidence found in his possession, left little doubt of his guilt. In 2006, Rodriguez was convicted and sentenced to death, the first federal death sentence handed down in North Dakota in more than a century. The trial brought some measure of justice to Drew's family, but it could not erase the pain of her loss. They sat through the proceedings, listening to the details of what had happened, carrying the weight of grief even as they sought accountability. For the community, the trial was a moment of both sorrow and clarity. The truth had been spoken in court, but the reality of Drew's absence remained. The emotional aftermath of Drew's death was immense. For her family, the loss of their daughter and sister was an ache that could never be fully healed. Drew had been a source of light in their lives, and her absence left a space that nothing could replace. Her friends, classmates, and professors mourned as well. On campus, her memory became a symbol of resilience and the importance of protecting others. Vigils were held, her name was spoken, and her story was shared widely. Her case also sparked broader changes. Drew's disappearance and death led to the creation of new laws and policies designed to strengthen protections against repeat offenders. Known as Drew's Law, the legislation created a national sex offender registry, giving communities more access to information about offenders living nearby. In this way, Drew's memory became a force for change, ensuring that her life would leave a legacy of protection for others. Drew Sjodin's story is one of promise interrupted, of a young woman whose life was taken far too soon. At 22, she carried dreams, love, and potential that could have shaped decades to come. Though her life was cut short, her memory has endured, not only in the hearts of her family and friends, but also in the laws that bear her name. Her story reminds us of both the fragility and the resilience of life. Fragile in how quickly it can be interrupted. Resilient in how memory, love, and determination can carry someone's presence forward even after their passing. Drew's legacy is not only one of loss, but also of change. Through her story, communities have become safer, and countless people have been protected. Her light, though dimmed in this world, continues to shine through the actions inspired by her memory. As we close her chapter, we hold her gently in remembrance, honoring the life she lived, the love she gave, and the legacy she left behind. And now, softly, we turn to our next story. Another life, another memory, carried gently through time. Sacramento in the early 1970s was a city of quiet neighborhoods and growing suburbs where government buildings and tree-lined streets framed the lives of families, students, and professionals. It was a time when the city felt smaller, more personal, and filled with the rhythm of everyday life. Among the young professionals making their way in Sacramento was Nancy Marie Bennallack. At 28 years old, Nancy was building a life defined by dedication, warmth, and accomplishment. She worked as a court reporter, a position that required precision, focus, and discipline. Those who worked alongside her admired her diligence, while her friends described her as kind, spirited, and caring. Nancy was engaged to be married, and her life appeared full of promise. Her days were spent balancing her work at the courthouse with her personal life, where she and her fiancé were preparing for the future they planned to build together. Friends recalled her joy at discussing wedding plans, her smile when she spoke of her fiancé, and the happiness that seemed to surround her. Her family adored her. To them, Nancy was not only a daughter and sister, but also a source of pride and love. They admired her determination, respected her independence, and looked forward to celebrating the milestones ahead. Her apartment in Sacramento was cozy and familiar, a space where she could relax after long days in courtrooms filled with the voices of others. It was her refuge, her private place of peace. On October 25, 1970, Nancy's life was abruptly and violently interrupted. That night would mark the end of her journey, though her story, and the mystery surrounding it, would continue for decades. It would become one of Sacramento's most enduring cold cases, resting unsolved for more than half a century, until modern science finally brought answers to questions her family had carried for years. The days leading up to October 25th carried the ordinary patterns of Nancy's life. She had been busy with her work as a court reporter, attending sessions and preparing transcripts with the accuracy that made her so respected in her profession. In her personal life, she and her fiancé were filled with anticipation for their upcoming wedding, a celebration they hoped would mark the beginning of many happy years together. Her friends recalled that she had been in good spirits. There was nothing to suggest that anything unusual or troubling was ahead. Her life was filled with plans, not with fear. On the evening of October 25th, Nancy spent time with her fiancé. The two of them shared dinner, enjoying the quiet comfort of each other's company. They spoke of their future, of the life they were preparing to share. When the evening drew to a close, her fiancé dropped her off at her apartment, as he had many times before. They said goodnight, and Nancy went inside, her thoughts likely still filled with the warmth of their plans together. Her apartment was located in a complex filled with other residents, a place that should have been safe. The area was quiet, familiar, and not known for crime. Nancy had no reason to expect that she was in danger. But as the night settled over Sacramento, someone else was nearby. Someone whose presence in that complex would alter Nancy's story forever. The build-up to her death carried no obvious warnings, no alarms that might have told her to be wary. It was an ordinary evening in every respect, until it wasn't. Sometime after Nancy returned to her apartment on October 25th, an intruder entered her home. Exactly how the person gained entry remains uncertain, but what is known is that Nancy's life ended within the walls of her own refuge. When Nancy failed to appear at work the next morning, her absence was immediately noticed. She was known for her professionalism, her punctuality, and her dedication. For her to miss work without explanation was out of character. Concern grew quickly, and her fiancé, along with others who cared for her, went to check on her apartment. Inside, they discovered the truth. Nancy had been killed. The details of what happened that night were deeply tragic, and though investigators documented them carefully, her loved ones were shielded from much of the horror. What mattered most to her family was that she was gone. Her life ended suddenly and violently. The news spread quickly through Sacramento. The idea that such a crime could take place in a quiet apartment complex targeting a young woman with no enemies left the community shaken. Her friends, her co-workers, and her fiancé were devastated, struggling to comprehend how Nancy's life had been stolen so suddenly. Her murder was both shocking and puzzling. She had been loved, respected, and admired. There was no clear motive, no obvious suspect, and no explanation that made sense. The suddenness of her death left behind not only grief, but also a mystery. Investigators arrived at Nancy's apartment quickly, combing through the scene for evidence. They documented the crime, took fingerprints, and searched for anything that might point to who had been responsible. Yet in 1970, forensic science was still limited. DNA testing had not yet been developed, and investigators had only the tools of their time: fingerprints, fibers, and eyewitness accounts. The apartment revealed signs of struggle, but no clear answers. It was evident that Nancy had fought, that she had resisted her attacker, yet the person who had taken her life left behind no identity. Neighbors were questioned. Some recalled hearing noises, while others noticed nothing unusual. No one had seen a stranger enter or leave. Whoever committed the crime seemed to vanish as suddenly as they had appeared. The lack of immediate answers left investigators with little to go on. They considered possible suspects: strangers, acquaintances, even the possibility of someone connected to her work. But none of these paths led to resolution. The crime appeared both deliberate and random, an unsettling combination that made it even harder to solve. For Nancy's family, the discovery was devastating. They had not only lost her, but they also had no clear explanation for why. Her fiancé, heartbroken, struggled to make sense of the sudden end to their plans. Friends who had celebrated her happiness only days before now found themselves mourning her loss. The cover-up, if it could be called that, was in the silence of the evidence. Whoever had taken Nancy's life had left few traces behind, and in 1970, that was enough to allow them to slip away unseen. In the weeks and months that followed, Sacramento police worked tirelessly to solve Nancy's case. They interviewed dozens of people, retraced her steps in the days before her death, and explored every lead that came their way. Yet each promising lead seemed to dissolve into uncertainty. Her case became one of the city's most haunting mysteries. The lack of motive baffled investigators. Nancy had no known enemies, no disputes that might have led to violence. The randomness of the act suggested a stranger, but without clear evidence, it remained only a theory. Forensic evidence was collected and preserved, though much of it could not be fully analysed with the technology available at the time. Detectives hoped that advances in science might one day reveal more than was possible in 1970. As years turned into decades, Nancy's case remained open. Detectives retired and new ones took their place, each inheriting the file and the responsibility of trying to bring resolution. Her family, meanwhile, carried the weight of unanswered questions. They lived through birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries with the ache of her absence, never forgetting the daughter and sister they had lost. The investigation spanned generations, with each new era bringing fresh hope that science or circumstance might finally reveal the truth. For more than 50 years, Nancy's case remained unsolved. No one came forward to confess. No trial was ever held. Her family lived with the uncertainty for decades, unable to see justice served. But in 2022, advances in DNA technology finally provided the breakthrough investigators had long hoped for. Evidence preserved from the crime scene was re-examined using modern forensic genealogy, a method that combines DNA analysis with family tree research. Through this technique, detectives were able to identify the man responsible for Nancy's death, Richard J. Owen Davis. Davis had been 27 at the time of the crime, living in Sacramento. He was unknown to Nancy, confirming the theory that the crime had been random. Davis had died in 1997, decades before the case was solved. With his death, there would be no trial, no chance for her family to face him in court. Yet the identification brought closure. After 52 years, the mystery had an answer. Her family finally knew who had taken Nancy's life, even if they would never hear him speak the reasons why. The emotional aftermath of Nancy's death stretched across generations. Her parents and fiancé carried the grief for the rest of their lives, never able to see the future she had dreamed of. Her siblings, too, lived with the loss, remembering her not only as a victim, but as a beloved sister whose kindness and spirit had shaped their lives. For her friends and co-workers, the loss was equally profound. The courthouse where she had worked felt her absence deeply. Those who had known her in her youth carried her memory forward, speaking of her with fondness and sorrow. When the case was finally solved in 2022, the emotions were mixed. There was relief in knowing the truth, gratitude that science had provided answers, but also sadness that it had taken so long. For decades, Nancy's story had been one of mystery and waiting. Now it was one of remembrance and closure. Her family expressed their gratitude to investigators who had never given up, who had carried her case through generations. Though the answers had come too late for her parents, they brought peace to those who remained. The story of Nancy Marie Bennallack is one of life interrupted, of promise unfulfilled, and of love carried forward across decades of mystery. At 28, she stood on the threshold of marriage, of new beginnings, and of a future filled with hope. Her story was cut short, but her memory has endured. Her case is also a testament to persistence. For 52 years, investigators refused to let her file grow cold. They preserved evidence, carried her name, and believed that one day the truth would come. That persistence was rewarded with answers, even if justice in the courtroom was no longer possible. Nancy is remembered not for the crime that ended her life, but for the way she lived, as a daughter, a sister, a fiancée, a professional, and a friend. Her story reminds us of the importance of remembrance, of carrying forward the legacies of those who are gone, and of honouring lives not only in sorrow but also in gratitude for the love they gave. As we close Nancy's chapter, we do so gently, with respect. Her story is no longer one of unanswered questions, but one of memory honoured, love remembered, and truth finally revealed. And now, softly, we turn to the next story. Another life, another memory, carried gently through time. The village of Theresa, Wisconsin sits quietly in Dodge County, surrounded by farmland, rolling fields, and winding country roads. In 2009, it was a place of close connections, where neighbors knew each other's names, where the seasons shaped the rhythm of life, and where quiet evenings often passed without disruption. It was the kind of community where unexpected events stood out sharply against the ordinary calm. In April of that year, something unusual was discovered along a roadside just outside the village. A passerby, travelling down a rural stretch, noticed something small lying near the edge of the road. At first it might have seemed like nothing, a bundle, perhaps discarded or forgotten, but on closer inspection, it became clear that it was something else entirely. Inside the bundle was the body of a newborn baby girl. She was tiny, fragile, and had never been given a chance to live beyond her first moments. She was unnamed, unknown, and unclaimed. The discovery shocked the community, leaving people struggling to understand how such a thing could happen in their quiet town. For investigators and residents alike, the baby came to be known simply as Baby Theresa. With no name, no known family, and no explanation for how she came to rest by that roadside, her story began as a mystery. Yet even in her anonymity, she stirred compassion, grief, and determination. Baby Theresa's case would stretch across years, marked by the careful work of investigators, the quiet sorrow of a community, and the eventual answers brought forward by science. Though her life had ended before it could begin, her story touched hearts and left an impression far greater than her brief time on Earth. The weeks leading to Baby Theresa's discovery remained cloaked in uncertainty. No one in the community had reported a missing newborn. No one had spoken of a young woman suddenly absent from her routine or struggling with the arrival of a child. There were no signs in hospitals, clinics, or schools that pointed clearly toward who might have been carrying the baby. What investigators later came to understand was that somewhere, quietly, a young woman had been pregnant. The circumstances of that pregnancy were unknown, whether she had support, whether she was frightened, whether she felt she had nowhere to turn. The pregnancy went unnoticed by most, concealed from family, neighbors, and perhaps even friends. On or around April 6, 2009, the baby was born. Whether she drew breath remains uncertain. Medical examiners later determined that the child may have been stillborn, though the condition of her body left some questions unanswered. If she had been alive at birth, her life was fleeting, ending before she had a chance to be held, named, or nurtured. Instead of being taken to a hospital or cared for in the way most newborns are, the baby was left by the roadside. Whether this was an act of desperation, fear, or something else entirely, no one could be certain. What was clear was that a child had been left alone and that silence had followed her into the world. For the community of Theresa, the build-up to this moment was invisible. No one had seen it coming, no one had known. Yet, in retrospect, the signs of hidden struggle may have been there, quiet and unnoticed, until it was too late. The discovery of Baby Theresa on April 6, 2009 brought a hush over the village of Theresa. Found by a passerby along Lone Road just outside of town, her small body was wrapped in a blanket, left with no explanation. She had not been buried, nor placed in a hospital. She had simply been left where chance alone determined she would be found. The moment of discovery was heartbreaking. For the passerby who first saw her, it was an image that would never leave their mind. For law enforcement, it was a case unlike most others. A child who had no identity, no story, and no one to speak for her. The county coroner and investigators examined her body with care. They found no clear injuries, no definitive sign of trauma. Their findings suggested she may have been stillborn, though it was impossible to say with certainty. The uncertainty deepened the sadness. If she had been alive even for a few minutes, her life had ended without acknowledgement. For the people of Theresa, the discovery carried a profound weight. A newborn baby with her whole life ahead of her had been left alone by the side of the road. The image was difficult to comprehend and the questions it raised were endless. Who was her mother? What had led to this? Could anything have been done to prevent it? Though no act of violence could be firmly proven, her abandonment itself felt like a tragedy. The moment of her discovery marked not only the end of her short life, but also the beginning of a mystery that would take years to unravel. From the beginning, investigators worked to uncover Baby Theresa's identity. They canvassed the area, speaking with residents, asking if anyone had noticed a young woman who appeared pregnant but was suddenly without a child. Hospitals and clinics were contacted, but none had records of a baby matching the time frame. The discovery seemed to point to secrecy. Whoever had given birth to Baby Theresa had done so quietly, outside the view of medical professionals, neighbors, or family. The choice to leave her body by the roadside suggested desperation or fear, though the reasons remained unknown. The blanket in which she was wrapped became one of the most important clues. Investigators studied its fabric, its design, hoping someone would recognize it. They released images to the public, asking if anyone had seen it before, perhaps in the possession of a neighbor or family member. Leads came in, but none led to a definitive answer. The cover-up, if it could be called that, was simple. Silence. No one came forward, and no one spoke. Without a name, Baby Theresa was laid to rest in a small cemetery in Dodge County. Community members attended her funeral, providing the love and dignity that had been missing from her brief life. Though she remained unnamed, she was not forgotten. The community carried her memory, vowing to continue searching for answers. For investigators, baby Theresa's case was unusual. Most cases begin with a name, a family, a history to trace. Here there was none of that. She had been found with no identity, no records, and no one stepping forward to claim her. Detectives pursued every avenue. They looked into young women in the area, asking questions delicately, hoping to find someone who had concealed a pregnancy. They studied medical waste sites, examined blankets and clothing, and followed tips that came from across the county. Each lead seemed promising, but none held. Years passed and the case grew cold, but law enforcement did not forget. They preserved what little evidence they had, knowing that one day science might provide answers that were beyond reach in 2009. That day came more than a decade later. With the advancement of genetic genealogy, investigators submitted baby Theresa's DNA for analysis. The results pointed them to relatives, distant at first, but enough to begin building a family tree. Slowly, carefully, they traced the connections backward until they identified her mother. The truth emerged quietly. Baby Theresa's mother had been a teenager in 2009, only 15 years old when she gave birth. Out of fear and uncertainty, she had delivered the baby in secret and left her body by the roadside. Medical examiners concluded the child had likely been stillborn. When investigators identified baby Theresa's mother, they approached the case with care. She was no longer the frightened teenager she had been in 2009, but an adult living with the memory of what had happened. She admitted to giving birth in secret and to leaving the baby by the roadside. Prosecutors reviewed the evidence carefully, because medical examiners could not prove that the child had been born alive, and because the mother herself had been a minor at the time, no charges were filed. The case was ruled a tragedy rather than a homicide. There was no trial, no courtroom testimony. Instead, there was acknowledgement of what had happened and acknowledgement of the sorrow it carried. For investigators, the confession was a bittersweet resolution. They had found the truth, but the truth itself was filled with sadness. For the community of Theresa, the resolution brought mixed emotions. On one hand, the mystery of baby Theresa's identity was solved. On the other, the circumstances of her death, and the knowledge that she may have never lived beyond her first moments, carried a deep sadness. Her story became a reminder of the importance of compassion. Many in the community reflected on the struggles her young mother must have faced, the fear and isolation that led her to act in secrecy. People asked themselves whether more support, more openness, or more resources might have prevented the tragedy. For those who had attended baby Theresa's funeral years earlier, the answers brought closure. She was no longer an unknown child. She had a mother, a story, and a name, even if that name was never publicly shared. Her memory lingered in the small cemetery where she was laid to rest. Visitors left flowers, toys, and quiet prayers. In their grief, the people of Theresa found ways to honor a life that had barely begun. The story of baby Theresa is one of mystery, sorrow, and remembrance. She lived only briefly, perhaps not at all, yet her presence touched countless lives. She reminded a community of the fragility of life, of the importance of compassion, and of the need to care for those who may be struggling in silence. Her case also demonstrated the power of persistence. For more than a decade, investigators held onto her file, waiting for the day when science would allow them to uncover the truth. That persistence ensured that she was not forgotten and that her story would one day be known. Though no charges were filed and no courtroom ever spoke her name, baby Theresa was honored in another way, through remembrance. She became a symbol of the need for empathy, for understanding, and for supporting those who faced difficult choices. Her life, brief as it was, continues to matter. She is remembered not as an unknown, but as a child who was loved by a community, cared for in her absence, and carried forward in memory. As we close her chapter, we do so gently, holding her story in our hearts and turning softly to the next. Another life, another memory, carried through time with quiet reverence. In 1993, Minneapolis was alive with the bustle of a growing city. The Mississippi River cut through its heart, its waters reflecting the glow of bridges and street lights. Neighborhoods carried their own unique character, some filled with the energy of new development, others marked by quiet homes where life moved at an unhurried pace. Amid this city lived Jeanie Marie Childs, a 35-year-old woman whose life had not been easy, but who carried resilience all the same. She had grown up in Minnesota, surrounded by family and friends who knew her as spirited, caring, and complex. Her path in adulthood had been shaped by challenges, including struggles with health and stability, yet those who knew her best remembered her as someone who tried to find joy, even in difficult times. Jeanie lived in an apartment near downtown, a place that reflected both independence and the challenges of her circumstances. She was connected to her family and had people who loved her, but she also lived with difficulties that made her story quieter, less often told. Her life was not the kind that would appear in headlines under ordinary circumstances. She was not famous or powerful. She was simply herself, a woman navigating life's hardships with determination. To those who loved her, that was enough. But in June of 1993, Jeanie's life came to a sudden and tragic end. She was discovered in her apartment, her death the result of violence. What followed was a mystery that would remain unsolved for nearly 3 decades, leaving her family with unanswered questions and her community with quiet sorrow. In the days leading to June 13, 1993, Jeanie's life followed its ordinary rhythm. She was living in an apartment building in the city, surrounded by neighbours who came and went, each carrying their own stories. The summer air was warm, and the city carried with it the sounds of people enjoying long days of light. Jeanie's life, though often difficult, was marked by her connections. She kept in touch with her family, and she sought to find her own way in a world that had not always been kind. Her struggles were not hidden. They were part of her journey, but she carried them with resilience. For those around her, Jeanie was someone who mattered. She had been seen recently, moving about the neighbourhood, going about her life as usual. Nothing seemed to suggest that danger was near. There were no warnings, no obvious signs that her story was about to shift. But someone else was watching, someone whose presence would soon change everything. Whether she knew this person well or only slightly remains uncertain. What is clear is that her path crossed with theirs in a way that would alter her story forever. The build-up to her death was quiet, unseen by most. Life moved forward normally until it suddenly and irreversibly did not. On June 13th, Jeanie was discovered in her apartment. She had been attacked. Her life ended violently. The discovery was shocking, not only for the nature of the crime, but for the fact that it had happened in a place meant to be her refuge. Her apartment, once a small space of independence, became a scene of tragedy. Neighbours were shaken, and her family was devastated. For those who loved her, the realization was unbearable. Jeanie was gone, taken suddenly and without warning. The police arrived quickly, documenting the scene, searching for evidence. In 1993, investigative tools were limited compared to today. DNA analysis was in its early stage. Guess, and many cases relied heavily on witness statements and physical evidence like fingerprints. What they found was troubling but inconclusive. Despite their efforts, no clear suspect emerged. Jeanie's life, though filled with connections, did not reveal anyone who might have wished her harm. Her case was complex, and the investigation soon became one of many in a city where violent crime, sadly, was not uncommon. Her death was reported in local news, but it did not draw national attention. Larger stories overshadowed hers, leaving her case known mainly to her community and loved ones. The investigation into Jeanie's death faced challenges from the beginning. The apartment offered clues, but they were not enough to point clearly to a suspect. Detectives worked with what they had, but leads grew thin. The truth seemed to slip away into silence. Whoever had harmed Jeanie had left little behind, or at least little that investigators could connect in 1993. The cover-up, intentional or not, was in the absence of usable evidence. For her family, the discovery of her death was heartbreaking. They struggled to understand not only the loss itself, but also the lack of answers. Days turned into weeks, weeks into years, and still the case remained unsolved. In Minneapolis, the case became one of many cold files, open but without resolution. Yet for Jeanie's family, it was never just another case. It was their daughter, their sister, their loved one. They waited for answers, even as decades passed. Over the years, Jeanie's case remained with the Minneapolis Police Department. Detectives reviewed it periodically, looking for ways to revive the investigation. Each time they faced the same challenge: evidence without resolution. But they preserved what they had. Among the items collected in 1993 was DNA evidence, carefully stored even when technology could not yet unlock its secrets. Detectives believed that one day, science might provide the answers that eluded them. That hope grew as DNA testing advanced in the 2000s and 2010s. New techniques allowed for more precise analysis, and forensic genealogy, the method of tracing DNA through family connections, became a powerful tool. In 2019, investigators submitted the preserved DNA from Jeannie's case for advanced analysis. Slowly, the process of building family trees began. Each branch narrowed the search, bringing them closer to the person who had been in her apartment in 1993. The investigation eventuated. Ellie identified a man, Jerry Westrom. He had lived in Minnesota at the time of the crime, and decades later, he was still residing in the state. Westrom was identified through forensic genealogy and confirmed through a unique piece of modern detective work. Investigators obtained a sample of his DNA from a napkin he discarded at a hockey game. The sample matched the evidence collected in Jeannie's apartment in 1993. In 2019, Westrom was arrested. The case, once cold, was suddenly alive again. For Jeannie's family, it was a moment of both relief and renewed grief. After decades of silence, the name of her killer was finally known. The trial that followed laid out the evidence. The DNA match was undeniable, and the jury found Westrom guilty of Jeannie's murder. After 26 years, justice had finally arrived. Though the verdict could not bring Jeannie back, it gave her family answers. The questions that had haunted them for decades were resolved, and the truth was spoken in court. For Jeannie's family, the aftermath of her death was a wound that never fully healed. The decades of waiting had been heavy, filled with birthdays, holidays, and anniversaries marked by her absence. Yet the resolution of the case brought a measure of peace. Her family could now speak her name without the shadow of mystery. They could remember her not only as a victim, but as the woman she had been, kind, resilient, and loved. The community too reflected on her story. Many had forgotten the details over the years, overshadowed by other cases, but the solving of her case reminded people of the importance of persistence, of never giving up on the search for truth. Jeannie's name, once quiet in the files of unsolved crimes, was spoken again, this time with resolution, remembrance, and love. The story of Jeanie Childs is one of sorrow, patience, and eventual justice. Her life ended far too soon, but her memory endured. For 26 years, her family carried the weight of uncertainty until science and persistence brought the truth to light. Her story reminds us of the importance of preserving hope, even when answers seem far away. It shows the power of love and memory, and the way modern tools can bring resolution to cases once thought unsolvable. Jeannie is remembered not for the violence that ended her life, but for the strength she showed in living it. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, someone who mattered deeply. As we close her chapter, we do so gently, holding her in remembrance and honoring the life she lived. And with that, we reach the end of tonight's journey. 12 stories, each carrying love, sorrow, and remembrance. Each a quiet reminder of the importance of memory and the way stories live on when we tell them softly together. And so we come to the end of tonight's journey. We've moved gently through 12 unseen true crime stories from across America, lives remembered, mysteries reflected upon, and truths carried forward with care. If you found peace in tonight's storytelling, I invite you to subscribe to Sleepy True Crime Stories. It helps me continue creating these calm spaces for you, night after night. Before you drift off, take a deep breath, let it out slowly, and allow yourself to rest. The stories have been told, the memories honored, and now it is time for quiet. Thank you for spending this time with me. Sleep well, dream gently, and may you find comfort in the stillness of the night.